You've been taught to believe that strength comes from having more control, more reassurance, more love, more understanding, more certainty from life. But if that were true, why do so many people who seem to have everything still feel heavy inside? Why does the mind stay restless even when the world gives it what it asked for? Why does the heart remain tired even after being seen, praised, or chosen? The truth is, real strength does not come from demanding more from life. It comes from needing less from it. Buddhist wisdom has revealed this for centuries. The more the mind clings, the more it suffers. The more the heart loosens its grip, the more inner freedom begins to grow. Tonight, as you listen to these lessons, something quiet but powerful will begin to change. Your need for control will soften. Your hunger for answers will begin to fade, and the pressure to make life give you more will slowly lift. In its place, a deeper strength will rise, calm, steady, open, and free. This is not just another talk to help you rest. This is a lesson in inner freedom. Are you ready? Let's begin. And now something begins to shift, not outside, not in the world, not in the behavior of others, but inside the quiet place where expectations are formed and silently defended. Because the moment the need for life to behave a certain way starts to loosen, a different kind of space opens. A space that does not fight every delay, every silence, every unexpected turn. What happens next may feel unfamiliar at first, but it carries a kind of relief that does not depend on circumstances. There is a subtle tension most people carry without noticing. It lives in the way the mind prepares scripts for how things should go, how people should respond, how time should unfold. It whispers quietly, shaping invisible agreements with life. Agreements that are never actually signed, yet deeply believed. When those agreements are broken, even in the smallest ways, the mind reacts as if something has gone wrong at a fundamental level. This is where much of human suffering quietly begins. The mind builds a picture of how the day should unfold. It decides what a conversation should feel like. It forms expectations about how quickly progress should happen, how smoothly relationships should move, how recognition should arrive at the right moment. None of these are spoken out loud, yet they hold immense power. They become the standard by which reality is judged, and reality, almost by nature, refuses to cooperate. A message is delayed. A plan changes without warning. A person responds in a way that feels distant or confusing. The outcome that seemed certain does not appear. And suddenly, the weight appears. Not because of what happened, but because it did not match what the mind had already decided should happen. The discomfort is not in the event itself. It is in the resistance to it. This resistance often feels justified. It feels natural to say things should have gone differently. It feels right to expect clarity, fairness, responsiveness, smoothness. But beneath that feeling lies a quiet attachment, a deep insistence that life must align with personal preference in order for peace to exist. And this is where the cycle continues. Because every time life moves in a different direction, the mind tightens. It questions, analyzes, replays. It tries to correct reality in its own way, even if only internally. It argues with what has already happened, as if the argument itself could reverse the moment. But the moment has already passed. The more the mind resists, the more energy is spent. The body tightens, the breath becomes shallow, the sense of ease disappears. All of this happens not because life is inherently unbearable, but because it is being compared, moment by moment, to an imagined version of how it should be. There is another way of moving through this. It begins not with changing the world, but with seeing clearly how the demand itself creates tension. The realization is simple, yet difficult to accept at first. Life does not need to follow the script in order for peace to exist. Peace is not found in perfect alignment, it is found in the absence of resistance. When the mind stops insisting, something begins to soften. A delayed response no longer carries the same weight. It is seen as a delay, not a violation. A changed plan becomes a shift, not a failure. A misunderstanding becomes a moment of difference, not a personal attack. These are small changes in perception, yet they carry immense impact. The inner experience begins to feel lighter, not because life has become easier, but because the pressure to make it behave has dissolved. This does not mean becoming passive or indifferent. It does not mean giving up preferences or desires. It means no longer attaching peace to whether those preferences are fulfilled. It means allowing life to unfold without turning every deviation into a source of suffering. There is strength in this kind of allowing. It takes awareness to notice the moment when expectation forms. It takes discipline to not immediately follow the impulse to resist. It takes patience to sit with discomfort without trying to reshape it. This is not weakness. It is a form of inner stability that does not depend on control. Control, in many ways, is an illusion the mind clings to for safety. It creates the sense that if everything can be managed, predicted, and aligned, then peace will follow. But the reality is different. The more control is pursued, the more fragile the mind becomes. Because any disruption feels like a threat. Any uncertainty feels like a loss of stability. Letting go of this constant need to control outcomes does not create chaos. It creates resilience. Resilience is not the ability to force life into a specific shape. It is the ability to remain steady when life takes unexpected forms. It is the quiet confidence that comes from knowing that peace is not dependent on external order. This understanding changes the way moments are experienced. Instead of constantly measuring reality against expectation, there is a shift toward observing what is present. The mind becomes less reactive, less urgent in its need to correct or fix. There is space between the event and the reaction. In that space, something new becomes possible. Clarity. The situation is seen more directly, without layers of judgment or resistance. Decisions can be made without emotional pressure. Responses become more thoughtful, less driven by impulse. Even difficult moments begin to carry a different quality. They are still challenging, but they are no longer overwhelming. This is where suffering begins to soften. Not disappear entirely, but lose its sharpness. The emotional spikes become less intense. The duration of discomfort shortens. The mind recovers more quickly. All of this happens not because life has changed, but because the relationship to it has changed. The demand has loosened. And with that, the constant friction between expectation and reality begins to fade. There is also a deeper layer to this shift. The identity that was built around control and expectation starts to dissolve. The idea of being someone who needs things to go a certain way in order to feel stable begins to weaken. In its place, a different sense of self emerges, one that is less rigid, less dependent, more adaptable. This kind of self does not break easily. It bends, it adjusts, it allows. It does not interpret every deviation as a threat. It does not collapse when plans fail or when people behave unpredictably. It remains steady, not because everything is under control, but because it no longer needs everything to be controlled. This is where true freedom begins to take shape. Freedom is often misunderstood as the ability to get whatever is desired. But that kind of freedom is unstable, because desires constantly change, and the world rarely aligns perfectly with them. Real freedom is quieter. It is the ability to remain at peace regardless of how things unfold. It is the absence of inner conflict. When the mind no longer argues with reality, there is nothing to defend. There is no need to prove that things should be different. There is no internal struggle to correct what cannot be changed. There is simply the experience of the moment as it is. This does not remove pain, but it removes unnecessary suffering. Pain may still arise, loss may still happen, disappointment may still be felt. But without the added layer of resistance, these experiences move through more naturally. They do not get trapped in cycles of rumination and frustration. They are allowed to be felt and then allowed to pass. There is a kind of peace in this process. It is not dramatic or intense. It does not feel like a sudden breakthrough. It feels steady, grounded, almost ordinary. But within that ordinariness, there is a depth that was not present before. A quiet ease that does not need constant reinforcement. This ease becomes more noticeable over time. Moments that would have previously caused irritation now pass without much disturbance. Situations that once triggered anxiety are handled with calm. There is less urgency to fix, less pressure to understand everything immediately. The mind becomes more spacious. And in that space, something important happens. Life is experienced more directly, not through the filter of expectation, not through the constant comparison to how things should be, but as a continuous unfolding of moments, some pleasant, some difficult, all part of a larger flow that does not need to be controlled to be lived. This kind of living carries a different quality. It is lighter, not because problems disappear, but because they are no longer carried with the same weight. The mind is not constantly preparing for the next disruption or trying to prevent it. There is a trust that whatever arises can be met without needing it to be different first. This trust is not blind. It is built through experience, through repeatedly seeing that resistance creates more tension and allowing creates more space, through noticing that peace is not found in perfect conditions, but in the absence of inner conflict. Over time, this becomes natural. The mind still forms preferences, but it does not cling to them as tightly. Expectations may still arise, but they are seen more clearly and released more easily. The gap between what is and what is wanted becomes less significant, and within that narrowing gap, suffering continues to soften. What remains is a steady presence, a way of moving through life that does not depend on constant alignment with personal desires, a way of experiencing moments without turning them into problems, a quiet strength that does not need the world to cooperate in order to feel whole. This strength is not loud, it does not announce itself, it does not seek recognition. It simply exists, steady and reliable, beneath the surface of changing circumstances. It is felt in the absence of urgency, in the ease of letting things be, in the quiet acceptance of what cannot be changed. And from this place, something else becomes possible. A deeper kind of engagement with life, not driven by the need to control outcomes, but by a genuine openness to experience. Actions are taken, efforts are made, but without the heavy attachment to results. There is participation without pressure, involvement without tension. This is where life begins to feel different, not because it has changed, but because the way it is held has changed. And in that change, a quiet freedom continues to grow. And as that quiet freedom begins to grow, something even more subtle starts to reveal itself. The need to control life softens, but another hidden weight remains. It lives in the space between people, in the silent expectation that others should understand, interpret and validate what is felt inside. It is not as obvious as the need to control outcomes, yet it carries just as much tension, because even when life is no longer being forced to match the mind, the heart can still be waiting. Waiting to be seen, waiting to be understood, waiting to be fully recognized. And when that does not happen, a different kind of discomfort appears, a quieter one, but deeper. There is a moment many people recognize but rarely question, a moment after explaining something important, after sharing a feeling, after trying to express something that matters. The words are spoken, the effort is made, but the response does not land the way it was hoped. The other person listens, but something feels off. The understanding is partial or completely missing, and in that moment, something tightens. The mind begins to search for better words. The heart begins to feel unseen. There is an urge to explain again, to clarify, to try harder, to be understood. It feels necessary, almost urgent, as if peace depends on closing that gap between what is felt and what is received. This is where the hidden hunger lives, the hunger to be fully understood. It does not always appear as a loud demand. Often it is quiet. It hides behind patience, behind repeated explanations, behind the willingness to keep trying. But beneath it, there is a deep attachment. A belief that emotional relief will come once the other person finally sees things clearly. And this belief quietly binds the heart, because understanding is not something that can be controlled. It depends on the other person's perspective, their emotional capacity, their experiences, their ability to listen without distortion. Even with the best intentions, full understanding is rare. People hear through their own filters, they interpret through their own stories. So the gap remains, and the more the heart depends on closing that gap, the more tension builds. There is a different way of relating to this. It begins with a simple but difficult realization. Being understood is not a requirement for inner peace. It is something that can be appreciated when it happens, but it does not need to be chased in order to feel whole. This shift changes everything, because now expression is no longer driven by the need for validation. It becomes something cleaner, something lighter. Words are shared because they are true, not because they must be confirmed. Feelings are expressed because they exist, not because they need to be approved. This removes a significant burden. The pressure to be perfectly understood begins to fade. The constant adjustment of language, the repeated attempts to explain, the emotional strain of trying to align someone else's perception with internal experience, all of it begins to loosen, and in that loosening, energy returns. There is less exhaustion in communication. Conversations become simpler. There is less need to correct every misunderstanding, less urgency to fix every misinterpretation. The heart no longer feels like it has to defend its reality in every interaction. This does not mean withdrawing or becoming distant. It means engaging without attachment. It means speaking clearly, honestly, and then allowing the other person to receive it in their own way, without turning their response into a measure of self-worth. It means accepting that some parts of the inner world may never be fully seen by others, and being at peace with that. There is a quiet strength in this acceptance, because it removes the dependency that often goes unnoticed, the dependency on external understanding to stabilize internal experience. When that dependency is released, something deeper becomes available: self-understanding, the ability to sit with one's own emotions without needing them to be translated for someone else, the capacity to witness internal states without immediately seeking external confirmation. This creates a sense of inner grounding that does not fluctuate based on how others respond. This grounding is not rigid, it is flexible, open but steady. It allows for connection without dependency. It supports communication without turning it into a transaction where understanding must be returned in order for peace to remain. Many conflicts are fueled by this hidden expectation. Two people trying to be understood at the same time, both feeling unseen, both trying harder, both becoming more frustrated. The conversation turns into a loop where each person is waiting for the other to finally get it. And when that does not happen, tension rises. But when one person releases the need to be fully understood, the dynamic changes. The urgency dissolves. The conversation slows down. There is more space to listen, not as a strategy to be understood in return, but as a genuine act of presence. This creates a different kind of connection, one that is not built on perfect alignment, but on mutual allowance. There is also a deeper layer to this shift. The identity that is tied to being understood begins to loosen. The idea that being seen clearly by others is necessary for feeling valid starts to fade. This opens the door to a more direct relationship with oneself, a relationship that does not depend on reflection. It is common to use others as mirrors, to understand oneself through their reactions, their feedback, their interpretations. This can be helpful, but it can also create a dependency. When the mirror is unclear or absent, confusion arises. The sense of self becomes unstable. Releasing the need to be understood breaks this pattern. It allows for a more immediate form of self-awareness, one that does not require external confirmation. Emotions are felt directly. Thoughts are observed directly. Experiences are processed internally without needing them to be validated from the outside. This builds a different kind of confidence. Not the kind that comes from approval, but the kind that comes from familiarity with one's own inner world. There is less doubt, less second-guessing, less need to check whether what is felt is acceptable or correct. This does not isolate. It actually deepens connection, because interactions are no longer burdened by hidden demands. There is more openness, more authenticity, because the need to manage how one is perceived is reduced. This allows for more honest expression, even if it is not perfectly understood. There is freedom in this honesty. Freedom from performing, from adjusting, from constantly monitoring how words are received. The focus shifts from controlling perception to simply being present. This creates a lighter, more natural flow in communication. Silence also begins to feel different. It is no longer uncomfortable or filled with the need to fill gaps. It becomes a space where presence can exist without explanation. There is no urgency to clarify everything, no pressure to make every feeling known. Some experiences remain internal, and that is no longer a problem. This changes the way relationships are experienced. There is less tension, less emotional negotiation, less need to extract understanding from others. Interactions become more about sharing space rather than resolving every difference. This allows for a more relaxed, more sustainable form of connection. It also changes how misunderstanding is perceived. Instead of being seen as a failure or a threat, it becomes a natural part of human interaction. People are different. They see the world differently. They interpret differently. Expecting perfect understanding is unrealistic, and releasing that expectation removes a significant source of friction. This does not mean accepting harmful behavior or avoiding necessary conversations. It means approaching them without the added burden of needing complete alignment. It means addressing issues clearly, but without tying emotional stability to the outcome of the conversation. This creates more clarity, more effectiveness, because communication is no longer clouded by the need to be validated. There is also a quiet peace that comes from knowing that some parts of the inner experience are inherently private. Not everything needs to be shared. Not everything needs to be explained. Some feelings can exist without being translated. This reduces the pressure to externalize every internal state, allowing for a more contained, more stable inner life. This containment is not suppression. It is a form of self-sufficiency. The ability to hold one's own experience without needing to distribute it in order to feel relief. This creates a deeper sense of independence, one that is not based on isolation, but on internal capacity. Over time, this capacity grows. The need to be understood becomes less intense. The moments of discomfort when misunderstanding occurs become shorter. The urge to explain repeatedly fades. There is more ease, more acceptance, more space. And within that space, something important becomes clear. Understanding, while valuable, is not essential for peace. It is something that can enrich connection, but it is not the foundation of inner stability. That foundation is built internally, through awareness, acceptance, and the ability to remain steady regardless of external perception. This realization carries a quiet power. It frees the heart from a subtle but constant dependency. It allows for a more direct experience of life, one that is not filtered through the need to be seen in a certain way. It creates a form of freedom that is not obvious, but deeply felt. A freedom that does not rely on agreement. A freedom that does not require explanation. A freedom that simply exists, steady and quiet, beneath the surface of every interaction. And from this place, connection becomes something different. Not a search for validation, but a sharing of presence. Not a demand to be understood, but an openness to relate. And in that shift, the heart becomes lighter. Not because it is finally understood, but because it no longer needs to be. And as the heart becomes lighter from no longer needing to be fully understood, another quiet habit begins to reveal itself. It hides in the way the mind looks at every moment, searching, analyzing, trying to extract something from it. Not just understanding from people, but meaning from life itself. A silent pressure that says every experience must explain something, teach something, lead somewhere. And when that meaning is not clear, something feels incomplete. There is a subtle exhaustion that comes from constantly trying to make sense of everything. It does not always appear as stress. Sometimes it feels like curiosity, like reflection, like the desire to grow. But beneath it, there can be a quiet insistence that every moment must justify itself. When something good happens, the mind wants to hold it, define it, give it a reason. When something difficult appears, the mind searches for lessons, for explanations, for a purpose that can make the discomfort feel acceptable. Even silence becomes something to interpret. Even waiting becomes something to question. And slowly, without noticing, life becomes a series of problems to solve instead of moments to live. There is a different way of being with experience. It begins with allowing some moments to remain without explanation. Allowing some seasons to pass without extracting meaning from them. Allowing some events to exist as they are, without turning them into symbols or lessons. This may feel uncomfortable at first, because the mind is used to building structure. It feels safer when things make sense, when there is a clear narrative, when everything fits into a larger story. Meaning provides a sense of control, a way to organize experience into something understandable. But this constant need for meaning can also create pressure. A delay is no longer just a delay. It becomes something that must be explained. A loss is no longer just a loss. It becomes something that must carry a lesson. Silence is no longer just silence. It becomes something that must be interpreted. This transforms simple experiences into heavy ones. The mind becomes busy, always working, always searching. It does not rest in the moment because it is trying to move beyond it, to find what it represents. And in doing so, it misses what is actually present. There is a quiet freedom in stepping out of this pattern. It does not mean rejecting meaning entirely. It means no longer forcing it into every space. It means allowing some experiences to be incomplete, to remain open, to exist without immediate resolution. This creates a different relationship with time. Instead of rushing to understand, there is a willingness to wait. Instead of needing clarity right away, there is an acceptance of uncertainty. This reduces the internal pressure that often goes unnoticed. Moments begin to feel lighter, not because they have changed, but because they are no longer carrying the weight of interpretation. A quiet evening does not need to represent anything. It can simply be quiet. A pause in progress does not need to signal failure or delay. It can simply be a pause. This allows the mind to rest. Rest not as inactivity, but as the absence of constant analysis, the absence of the need to turn every experience into something useful or meaningful. This rest creates space, and in that space, a different kind of clarity can appear. A clarity that is not forced. When meaning is not chased, it often arrives on its own. not as a result of effort, but as a natural unfolding. Insights appear without pressure. Understanding deepens without being demanded. This is a quieter, more organic process. It requires patience, the willingness to not know immediately, the willingness to let experiences settle without rushing to conclusions. This patience is not passive, it is active in its openness, in its ability to hold uncertainty without discomfort. There is also a deeper layer to this shift. The identity that depends on constant growth and understanding begins to loosen. The idea that every moment must contribute to progress, to development, to a larger purpose starts to fade. This reduces the pressure to always be moving forward, always improving, always learning something. This does not stop growth, it changes the way growth happens. Instead of being forced, it becomes natural. Instead of being measured constantly, it becomes something that unfolds quietly. This creates a more sustainable, less stressful form of development. The mind becomes less rigid. It no longer needs everything to fit into a clear structure. It becomes more comfortable with ambiguity, with open-ended experiences, with moments that do not lead anywhere specific. This flexibility reduces tension. There is also a shift in how difficulty is experienced. When something challenging happens, the immediate reaction is often to search for meaning, to ask what it teaches, what it represents, why it is happening. This can be helpful at times, but it can also create pressure when answers are not available. Releasing the need for immediate meaning allows the experience to be felt more directly. The discomfort is not avoided, but it is not complicated by analysis. There is space to feel without needing to explain. This often leads to a more natural processing of emotion. Emotions move differently when they are not being interpreted constantly. They rise, they are felt, and they pass. The mind does not hold on to them in an attempt to understand them fully. This reduces the tendency to get stuck in loops of thinking. There is also a quiet acceptance that some things may never fully make sense. Some losses do not have clear lessons. Some endings do not provide closure. Some moments remain unresolved. Accepting this does not create despair. It creates space. Space where life can continue without needing every piece to fit perfectly. This acceptance reduces the need to control the narrative of life. The story does not need to be complete at every moment. It can remain open, evolving, unfinished. This allows for a more flexible way of experiencing time and events. There is also a shift in how presence is experienced. When the mind is not searching for meaning, it becomes more available to what is happening now. Attention is no longer divided between the present and the analysis of it. This deepens the experience of each moment. Simple things become more noticeable. The feeling of breathing, the sound of a quiet space, the movement of time without the need to define it. These are often overlooked when the mind is busy searching for meaning. This simplicity carries its own form of richness. Not because it leads to something greater, but because it is complete in itself. This changes the way satisfaction is experienced. It becomes less dependent on outcomes and more connected to presence. There is also a reduction in comparison. When meaning is not constantly being assigned, there is less need to compare experiences to expectations or to other moments. Each moment stands on its own, without needing to measure up to something else. This reduces internal conflict. The mind is not evaluating constantly. It is not asking whether this moment is meaningful enough, productive enough, significant enough. It is simply allowing the moment to exist. This allowance creates ease. Ease that does not come from achieving something, but from not needing to achieve something in every moment. This is a subtle but powerful shift. It also changes how the future is perceived. The need to ensure that future moments will be meaningful reduces. There is less pressure to plan every step with purpose. This creates more openness, more flexibility, more willingness to move without knowing exactly where it leads. This does not remove direction, it removes the rigidity around it. Goals can still exist, intentions can still be set, but they are held more lightly. This reduces anxiety about outcomes and allows for a more adaptable approach. There is also a deeper trust that develops. Trust that not everything needs to be understood immediately. Trust that meaning, when it is relevant, will appear in its own time. This reduces the urgency that often drives overthinking. Overthinking is often fueled by the need to make sense of things. When that need is reduced, the mind becomes quieter. Thoughts still arise, but they are not chased as intensely. This creates a more stable, internal environment. There is also a shift in how silence is experienced. Silence is no longer something that needs to be filled or explained. It becomes a space of rest, of presence, of openness. This changes the quality of quiet moments. They become less uncomfortable, less filled with the need to do something with them. They are allowed to exist without purpose, and in that, they become more peaceful. This also affects how relationships are experienced. Conversations do not need to carry deep meaning every time. Interactions can be simple, light, without needing to lead to insight or resolution. This reduces pressure and allows for more natural connection. There is also a reduction in self-judgment. When not every moment needs to be meaningful, there is less pressure to always be doing something important or significant. This allows for rest without guilt, for pauses without criticism. This creates a more compassionate relationship with oneself. A recognition that life includes moments of stillness, of uncertainty, of lack of direction, and that these moments are not failures, but part of the natural flow. Over time, this becomes more natural. The mind still seeks meaning at times, but it is not as dominant. It does not control the experience of every moment. There is more balance between understanding and simply being. And within that balance, something important becomes clear. Life does not need to be fully understood to be lived fully. Meaning can enrich experience, but it is not required for peace. Peace can exist in moments that are simple, quiet, undefined. This realization carries a quiet strength. It removes a layer of pressure that is often invisible. It allows for a more direct, more immediate experience of life. It creates space where the soul can rest. And in that rest, something light begins to grow. Not forced, not defined, not explained, just present and enough. And as the need to force meaning begins to fade, another layer quietly reveals itself. The mind becomes less busy, the soul begins to feel lighter, and yet there is still a subtle emptiness that can appear in certain moments. Not because something is missing in life, but because something is being asked from love that it was never meant to carry. This is where a deeper hunger lives, a hunger that is often mistaken for love itself. There is a kind of tiredness that does not come from lack of love, but from the constant need for love to reassure, confirm, and prove itself. It shows up in small ways, in waiting for messages that must arrive at the right time, in noticing when attention feels different, in measuring tone, effort, consistency, and presence. It is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, almost invisible, but it carries weight, a silent question that repeats itself in different forms. Am I still valued? Am I still important? Is this still real? And when the answer is not immediately clear, something inside begins to tighten. This is what emotional starvation feels like. Not the absence of love, but the constant feeling that it is not enough unless it is confirmed again and again. It creates a cycle where love is never fully received, because it is always being evaluated. Even when affection is present, the mind looks for signs that it might fade. Even when connection exists, the heart searches for reassurance that it will not disappear. And in that search, the experience of love becomes heavy. There is a quiet shift that changes this entirely. It begins when love is no longer treated as something that must constantly prove its presence. When the heart no longer depends on repeated confirmation to feel secure, something begins to relax. The need to monitor every detail fades. The urge to interpret every action softens. Love is no longer something that must be measured in order to be trusted. This does not remove care. It removes dependency. There is a difference between appreciating love and relying on it to define one's sense of worth. When love becomes the source of identity, it carries too much responsibility. It is asked to fill every gap, to calm every fear, to provide constant stability. And no human connection can carry that weight without strain. Releasing this expectation does not reduce love. It allows it to breathe. It allows love to exist without pressure, without the constant need to validate, without being turned into a system of emotional survival. This changes the way connection is experienced. Instead of looking for proof, there is presence. Instead of seeking reassurance, there is trust. Instead of measuring love, there is an openness to receive it as it comes, without turning it into a requirement for feeling whole. This creates a sense of internal fullness, not because love disappears, but because it is no longer the only source of emotional stability. The heart becomes less dependent on external confirmation and more grounded within itself. This grounding changes everything. It reduces anxiety in relationships. The need to check, to question, to analyze decreases. There is more space for natural interaction, for moments to unfold without being evaluated. There is also a shift in how absence is experienced. When love is tied to constant presence, any distance feels threatening. Silence becomes heavy. Space becomes uncomfortable. But when the need for constant proof is released, absence is no longer interpreted as loss. It becomes part of the rhythm. Connection can exist even in distance. Care can remain even when it is not actively expressed. This creates a more stable, less reactive form of attachment. Attachment itself begins to transform. It becomes less about holding on and more about allowing, less about securing and more about trusting. This does not weaken bonds. It strengthens them by removing the pressure that often causes tension. There is also a change in how one relates to their own emotions. Instead of immediately seeking comfort from others, there is a growing ability to sit with feelings internally. Discomfort is not automatically outsourced. It is acknowledged, felt, and allowed without rushing to fill it. This builds emotional resilience, the capacity to remain steady even when external reassurance is not available. This does not create isolation. It creates independence within connection. Relationships become something shared, not something relied upon for survival. There is also a quiet honesty that emerges. Without the need to secure love through constant validation, communication becomes clearer. There is less fear of expressing truth, less tendency to adjust behavior to maintain approval. This creates more authentic interactions. Authenticity deepens connection, not because it guarantees stability, but because it removes pretense. There is less performance, less effort to appear in a certain way. This allows relationships to develop based on reality rather than expectation. There is also a reduction in emotional bargaining. The subtle exchange where actions are performed in hopes of receiving something in return begins to fade. Kindness is given without calculation. Attention is shared without expectation. This creates a cleaner form of connection, one that is not built on transaction, but on presence. This presence feels different. It is not tense or urgent. It is calm, steady, open. It does not need to be reinforced constantly. It exists quietly, without needing to prove itself in every moment. This changes the experience of closeness. Closeness is no longer measured by frequency or intensity. It is felt in the quality of interaction, in the ease of being together, in the absence of pressure. This creates a deeper, more sustainable form of intimacy. There is also a shift in how insecurity is experienced. Instead of being driven by it, there is awareness of it. It is seen as a passing state, not a permanent condition. This reduces its influence. It does not control behavior in the same way. This awareness creates choice, the ability to respond rather than react, the ability to remain grounded even when uncertainty appears. This strengthens the sense of self within relationships. The sense of self becomes more stable, less influenced by external changes, less dependent on others' actions. This does not create distance. It creates a balanced connection where both individuals can exist without losing themselves. There is also a deeper appreciation that emerges. When love is not taken for granted, but also not demanded, it is experienced more fully. Small gestures carry more meaning. Simple presence feels enough. This increases satisfaction. Satisfaction is no longer tied to intensity. It is found in consistency, in quiet moments, in the simple act of sharing space. This reduces the need for constant excitement or reassurance. There is also a release from comparison. The tendency to measure one relationship against another, to evaluate based on external standards, begins to fade. Each connection is experienced on its own terms. This reduces unnecessary dissatisfaction. There is also a quiet acceptance of imperfection. No relationship is flawless. No person can meet every need. Accepting this reduces frustration. It allows for a more realistic and compassionate view of connection. This compassion extends inward. There is less self-blame when things feel uncertain, less pressure to be perfect in order to be loved. This creates a more gentle relationship with oneself. Over time, this becomes natural. The need for constant proof diminishes. The heart becomes less reactive. There is more ease, more trust, more stability. Love is no longer something that must be secured continuously. It is something that can be experienced without fear. And within this experience, something important becomes clear. Love does not need to complete you in order to be meaningful. It can exist alongside a sense of wholeness, not as a replacement for it. This changes the way connection is approached. It becomes something shared between two whole individuals, rather than something used to fill internal gaps. This creates a different kind of bond. One that is less fragile, less dependent, more resilient. It can withstand distance, change, uncertainty, without collapsing. This is a quieter but stronger form of connection. There is also a freedom in this. Freedom from the constant need to secure love. Freedom from the fear of losing it. Freedom to engage without attachment to outcome. This allows for a more open, more relaxed way of relating. This openness carries a different kind of depth. Not based on intensity, but on steadiness. Not on constant reassurance, but on quiet trust. This depth feels more sustainable, more grounded. And within this grounding, something else appears. A sense of peace that is not dependent on the presence of love. A peace that exists regardless of connection, that remains steady even in absence. This is where emotional starvation ends. Not because love becomes constant, but because the need for it to be constant dissolves. And in that dissolution, the heart becomes lighter, not empty, but free. And as the heart becomes free from needing love to constantly prove itself, another quiet dependency begins to surface. It is less obvious, often even praised by the world, yet it carries a hidden weight. It lives in the way a person looks outward for small signals to feel secure. A kind word, a compliment, a moment of recognition. These things seem harmless, even good, but when they become the source of identity, something deeper begins to drift. Because now, worth is no longer felt from within. It is borrowed. and anything borrowed must eventually be returned. There is a subtle tiredness that comes from this way of living. It is not always recognized immediately. It shows up in the need to be noticed, in the quiet disappointment when effort is not acknowledged, in the way the mood shifts depending on how others respond. When praise is present, there is a lift, a sense of validation, of being seen, of being enough. But when it is absent, even briefly, something feels missing, not because the value has disappeared, but because the connection to it was never internal to begin with. This creates a fragile center, a center that moves depending on external voices, a center that feels strong one moment and uncertain the next. This instability is not caused by a lack of ability or worth, but by where that worth is being sourced. The world becomes a mirror, and every reflection begins to matter more than it should. A compliment feels like truth. A lack of recognition feels like doubt. A criticism feels like a threat. The mind begins to organize identity around these reflections, shaping itself according to what is received. This is where exhaustion begins, because maintaining this external alignment requires constant attention. There is a need to perform, to adjust, to anticipate how actions will be perceived. Even simple decisions begin to carry weight, not because of their intrinsic value, but because of how they might be judged. This takes energy that could be used for presence, for creativity, for simply being. Instead, it is spent managing perception, seeking approval, maintaining a certain image. There is a different way of existing. It begins when praise is no longer treated as a requirement for feeling stable, when compliments are received but not depended on, when recognition is appreciated but not used as proof of worth. This shift is quiet but powerful, because it returns attention inward. Instead of asking, "How am I seen?" the question becomes, "What is true here?" Instead of measuring value through reaction, there is a direct connection to one's own experience, one's own sense of alignment. This creates a different kind of center, a center that is not easily shaken, because it is not built on fluctuating input. It is grounded in awareness, in a direct relationship with oneself that does not require constant confirmation. This does not remove appreciation for praise, it changes its role. Praise becomes something that can be enjoyed without being clung to. It is no longer a necessity, but a pleasant addition. This reduces dependency and increases freedom. Freedom from needing to be seen in a certain way. Freedom from adjusting behavior to maintain approval. Freedom from the constant monitoring of how one is perceived. This allows for more natural expression. Actions are no longer filtered through the question of how they will be received. They are guided by internal clarity, by intention, by a sense of authenticity that does not need to be justified externally. This authenticity feels different. It is quieter, less performative, less driven by outcome. It does not seek attention, yet it often draws it naturally. Not because it is trying to impress, but because it is grounded. There is also a reduction in comparison. When identity is no longer tied to praise, there is less need to measure oneself against others. The focus shifts from external positioning to internal alignment. This reduces tension and creates a more stable sense of self. There is also a change in how criticism is experienced. Without dependence on praise, criticism loses some of its weight. It is still heard, still considered, but it does not destabilize identity in the same way. This allows for growth without fear. Feedback becomes information, not judgment. This creates a more open, more flexible approach to improvement. There is less defensiveness, less need to protect an image. This supports a more honest relationship with one's own strengths and limitations. There is also a deeper layer to this shift. The identity that was built around being recognized begins to dissolve. The idea of needing to be acknowledged in order to exist meaningfully starts to fade. This creates space for a more direct experience of self, a self that is not defined by external response. This does not create isolation. It creates independence within connection. Relationships are no longer used as mirrors to define worth. They become spaces for interaction, for sharing, for connection, without the hidden demand for validation. This changes the quality of interaction. There is less pressure, less need to impress, less concern about maintaining a certain image. This allows for more genuine connection, more openness, more ease. There is also a shift in motivation. When praise is not the driving force, actions are guided by something deeper: curiosity, interest, intention. This creates a more sustainable form of engagement. Work becomes less about recognition and more about expression. Effort becomes less about outcome and more about process. This reduces burnout because energy is not tied to external response. It is generated internally through engagement, through presence, through alignment with what feels meaningful. There is also a quiet confidence that emerges, not loud, not performative, but steady. A confidence that does not need to be announced because it is not dependent on being confirmed. It exists quietly, beneath the surface, consistent and reliable. This confidence supports resilience. When external conditions change, when recognition is absent, when attention shifts, the center remains stable. This reduces anxiety and creates a more grounded way of moving through life. There is also a deeper sense of contentment. When praise is no longer required, satisfaction is not delayed. It is felt in the act itself, in the experience of doing, of being, of engaging with life directly. This changes the relationship with achievement. Achievements are still valued, but they are not used as proof of worth. They are expressions of effort, of interest, of engagement. This reduces pressure and increases enjoyment. There is also a release from performance. The need to maintain a certain image fades. There is less concern about how things appear, more focus on how they feel. This creates a more relaxed, more authentic way of living. There is also a deeper connection to presence. Without the constant monitoring of external response, attention returns to the moment. This increases awareness, clarity, and ease. Moments are experienced more fully, not filtered through the need to be recognized but felt directly. This creates a richer experience of life, not because of external input, but because of internal availability. There is also a shift in how silence is experienced. Silence is no longer uncomfortable due to lack of recognition. It becomes a space of rest, of being, without the need to fill it with validation. This supports a more stable inner environment, one that does not fluctuate based on external feedback. Over time, this becomes natural. The need for praise diminishes. The dependence on recognition fades. The center becomes more stable, more grounded, more internal. And within this stability, something important becomes clear. Worth does not need to be proven. It does not need to be confirmed. It exists. And when this is felt directly, without reliance on external voices, there is a quiet return. A return to a center that was always there, but often overlooked. A center that does not move with praise or criticism. A center that remains steady, regardless of how the world responds. And from this place, life begins to feel different, less heavy, less dependent, more free. And as that quiet center becomes steady, no longer rising and falling with praise or silence, something even deeper begins to come into view. There is still a subtle movement in the mind, a habit so familiar that it often goes unnoticed. It is the quiet negotiation that happens with reality itself. A constant internal dialogue that tries to reshape what has already happened, soften what feels uncomfortable, or push away what does not match preference. Even without seeking approval, even without needing validation, the mind can still be in quiet resistance. And that resistance carries its own weight. There is a kind of tiredness that does not come from effort, but from arguing with what cannot be changed. It appears in small moments. A situation unfolds, and immediately the mind begins to respond, not by meeting it, but by pushing against it. This should not be happening. This could have been different. This needs to change before I can feel okay. These thoughts may seem natural, even justified, but they create friction, not with the world, but within the self. Because reality has already taken its shape, and the mind is still trying to reshape it. This creates tension. Not loud, not always dramatic, but constant. A background pressure that keeps the body tight and the mind restless. Even when nothing is actively wrong, there is a subtle resistance to what is present. This is the negotiation. A silent attempt to make life more acceptable before allowing peace. But there is another way. A way that does not involve giving up, but involves letting go of the argument. A way that does not mean agreement with everything, but means no longer fighting what has already become real. This is where rest begins to appear. Not the kind of rest that comes from sleep, but a deeper rest, one that comes from the absence of internal conflict. When the mind stops pushing against the moment, something softens, the shoulders drop, the breath deepens, the urgency fades. Nothing outside has changed, but inside the pressure is gone. This kind of rest is unfamiliar at first, because the mind is used to staying active, used to analyzing, correcting, resisting. It believes that by negotiating with reality, it can create a better experience. But in truth, it often creates the opposite. It creates strain. Letting go of this strain does not mean becoming passive. It means seeing clearly. Seeing that what is happening has already happened. That the moment exists as it is, regardless of opinion. That resistance does not undo it, but adds another layer to it. When this is seen deeply, not just understood but felt, something shifts. The need to correct the moment begins to dissolve, and in that dissolution, space opens. This space is important because it allows for a different kind of response. Instead of reacting from resistance, there is the possibility of responding from clarity. The situation is seen without distortion, without the added pressure of how it should be. This clarity supports action. Action that is grounded, not reactive. Action that addresses what is needed without being driven by frustration. This is a different kind of strength, not forceful but steady. There is also a shift in how discomfort is experienced. Discomfort does not disappear, but it is no longer multiplied by resistance. It is felt more directly, without the added layer of judgment or rejection. This makes it more manageable. Pain becomes simpler, not easy, but less complicated. It is not turned into a problem that must be solved immediately. It is allowed to exist, to move, to change. This reduces suffering. Because suffering often comes from the struggle against pain, not from the pain itself. When that struggle ends, even difficult experiences become lighter. There is also a quiet acceptance that begins to grow. Not forced, not imposed, but natural. It comes from seeing that reality does not need approval to exist. It simply is. And meeting it directly creates less tension than resisting it. This acceptance is not resignation. It is alignment. Alignment with what is present without adding unnecessary conflict. It allows for engagement without resistance, for action without frustration. There is also a change in how control is perceived. The need to control every aspect of the moment begins to fade. There is a recognition that not everything can be shaped according to preference, and that this is not a problem. It is simply the nature of life. This recognition reduces pressure, because the mind no longer needs to manage everything. It can focus on what is within reach, what can actually be influenced, without being burdened by what cannot. This creates a more efficient use of energy. Energy is not wasted on internal arguments. It is available for presence, for action, for awareness. This increases effectiveness without increasing effort. There is also a deeper layer to this shift. The identity that was built around resistance begins to loosen. The idea of being someone who must always correct, fix, or oppose reality starts to dissolve. This creates space for a different way of being, a way that is more flexible, more open, more at ease. This ease is not dependent on circumstances. It exists even when things are not ideal, even when challenges arise, even when outcomes are uncertain. It comes from the absence of internal conflict, not from the perfection of external conditions. There is also a change in how time is experienced. Without constant resistance, moments feel less rushed. There is less urgency to move past discomfort, less need to escape the present. This creates a slower, more grounded experience. Time feels more spacious, more available. This allows for deeper awareness. Awareness that is not clouded by reaction, but clear and direct. This supports better understanding, better decisions, better presence. There is also a shift in how relationships are experienced. Without the need to negotiate reality, interactions become simpler. There is less resistance to others' behavior, less need to correct or change them in order to feel at ease. This reduces conflict, not by avoiding issues, but by removing unnecessary tension. Conversations become more direct, more honest, less reactive. This creates more stable connections, connections that are not driven by the need to control or correct, but by a willingness to meet each other as they are. There is also a deeper sense of trust that develops. Trust in the process of life, in the unfolding of moments, in the ability to respond without needing everything to be perfect first. This trust is not blind. It is grounded in experience, in the repeated observation that resistance creates more strain and acceptance creates more space. Over time, this becomes natural. The mind still reacts at times, still resists occasionally, but it returns more quickly to ease. The pattern of negotiation weakens, and the pattern of acceptance strengthens. And within this shift, something important becomes clear. Reality does not need to be negotiated in order to be lived. It can be met directly, without argument, without resistance, without the need to reshape it before allowing peace. This is where rest appears, not as an escape, but as a presence that does not push away what is difficult, but also does not fight it. A presence that sits beside truth without needing it to be different. This sitting is quiet. It does not draw attention, but it carries strength. A strength that is not based on control, but on acceptance. A strength that does not depend on outcome, but on stability. And from this place, life begins to feel different, less heavy, less urgent, more open, more calm. Not because everything has changed, but because the need to negotiate with it has ended. And as the mind begins to rest, no longer arguing with what is already here, something even more hidden starts to surface. The tension is quieter now, less obvious, but still present in subtle ways. It appears in the silent expectations carried into each moment. Not the loud kind of demands, but the quiet belief that certain things should be given, that certain outcomes should naturally arrive, that life should unfold with a certain level of fairness, comfort, and recognition. This belief feels normal, so normal that it is rarely questioned. Yet it shapes how every experience is felt. There is a feeling that comes when things do not go as expected. Not just disappointment, but something sharper. A sense that something has been taken, that something was deserved but not received. It is not just that the outcome is unpleasant, but that it feels wrong. This feeling often comes from entitlement, not in the way it is usually described, not arrogance or selfishness, but a quiet assumption that life should provide certain things in a certain way. That effort should always lead to reward, that kindness should always be returned, that fairness should always prevail. When these expectations are not met, the mind reacts. It questions, it resists, it feels unsettled. Why did this happen? This should not have gone this way. I did everything right. These thoughts create a particular kind of suffering. Because they are not just responses to the moment, they are reactions to a broken expectation. An expectation that was never guaranteed, yet deeply believed. This creates a fragile experience of life, one where peace depends on conditions being met. Where comfort is expected, fairness is assumed, recognition is anticipated. And when life moves outside of these expectations, the sense of stability is disturbed. There is another way of relating to this. It begins with seeing clearly that life does not operate on personal agreements, that it does not owe comfort, fairness, or perfect outcomes. This realization can feel uncomfortable at first, because it removes a layer of expectation that provided a sense of order. But beneath that discomfort, something important begins to form: freedom. When entitlement begins to dissolve, the relationship with life changes. Moments are no longer filtered through the question of whether they are deserved. They are experienced more directly, without the added layer of expectation. This reduces friction that was created not by the event itself, but by the belief that it should have been different. Without that belief, the experience becomes simpler. Not necessarily easier, but less complicated. There is less internal argument, less resistance, less need to correct what has already happened. This creates space for acceptance, for clarity, for a more grounded response. There is also a shift in how effort is experienced. Effort is no longer tied to guaranteed results. It becomes something that is offered, not something that must be rewarded. This changes motivation. Actions are taken because they align with intention, not because they are expected to produce a specific outcome. This reduces pressure, because the mind is no longer calculating what should be received in return. There is also a change in how others are perceived. Without entitlement, there is less expectation that others must behave in certain ways. This reduces frustration. People are seen more clearly without the filter of how they should act. This creates more realistic expectations, and with that, more stable relationships. There is also a deeper layer to this shift. The identity that was built around being treated a certain way begins to loosen. The idea that one deserves constant comfort, constant recognition, constant fairness starts to fade. This does not create passivity, it creates resilience. Resilience that comes from not depending on conditions to feel stable. The ability to remain steady even when things are not ideal. This is a different kind of strength, a strength that does not rely on external support. There is also a reduction in comparison. When entitlement is present, there is often a comparison between what is received and what others receive. This creates dissatisfaction. Without entitlement, this comparison weakens. Each experience is seen on its own, without needing to measure it against an expected standard. This reduces unnecessary tension. There is also a shift in how disappointment is experienced. Disappointment still arises, but it is not amplified by the belief that something was owed. It is felt more directly, without the added layer of injustice. This makes it easier to move through, because the mind is not holding on to the idea that something has been taken unfairly. It is simply acknowledging what is present. There is also a quiet acceptance of uncertainty. Life is seen as something that unfolds without guarantees. This reduces the need to predict, to control, to secure outcomes. This acceptance creates ease that does not depend on certainty but on flexibility, the ability to move with what happens rather than against it. There is also a change in how gratitude is experienced. Without entitlement, gratitude becomes more natural. Because things are no longer expected, they are appreciated when they occur. This increases the sense of satisfaction. Even small moments carry value, not because they fulfill an expectation, but because they are recognized as they are. There is also a deeper sense of humility, not in the sense of lowering oneself, but in recognizing that life is not centered around personal expectations. This creates a more balanced perspective, a perspective that is less demanding, more open. There is also a shift in how control is perceived. Without entitlement, the need to control outcomes reduces. There is an understanding that not everything can be shaped according to preference. This reduces stress because the mind is no longer trying to enforce an imagined agreement with life. There is also a change in how patience is experienced. Patience becomes easier when there is no expectation of immediate reward. Waiting is no longer seen as a failure of timing, but as part of the process. This creates a more relaxed relationship with time. There is also a deeper sense of presence. Without the constant evaluation of whether something is deserved, attention returns to the moment. This increases awareness and clarity. Moments are experienced more fully, without the distraction of expectation. There is also a shift in how failure is perceived. Failure is no longer seen as a violation of what should have happened. It becomes an event, a result, without the added weight of entitlement. This makes it easier to learn and move forward. There is also a quiet strength that begins to develop. A strength that does not depend on fairness or comfort. A strength that remains steady even when things are difficult. This strength is not rigid. It is flexible, adaptable, open. There is also a deeper sense of freedom. Freedom from needing life to meet certain standards. Freedom from the constant pressure of expectation. Freedom to experience moments as they are. This freedom is not loud. It is quiet, steady, consistent. And within this quiet, something important becomes clear. Peace does not come from life being fair. It comes from not needing it to be. This realization changes everything because it removes a fundamental source of tension, the belief that life should align with personal expectation. Without that belief, the relationship with life becomes simpler, more direct, more open. And in that openness, something new begins to grow. A sense of stability that does not depend on conditions. A sense of peace that is not tied to outcome. A sense of freedom that comes from needing less. And from this place, life begins to feel different. Not because it has become easier, but because it is no longer being measured against what it was never required to provide. And as the weight of entitlement begins to fall away, something else becomes easier to see. Life no longer needs to be fair, and slowly, the same understanding begins to extend toward people. Because much of the tension that once came from expecting perfect outcomes also lives in the expectation of perfect behavior from others, not always in obvious ways, but in quiet assumptions, that they should know what to say, that they should respond with care every time, that they should understand without needing explanation, that they should love in a way that feels complete, and when they don't, something inside tightens. There is a kind of pain that comes not just from what people do, but from what they fail to do. A missed gesture, a careless word, a moment where presence is absent when it was needed most. These moments stay longer than they should, not because they are large, but because they collide with expectation. A quiet belief that says, they should have done better. This belief creates a subtle form of resistance, not toward life, but toward people. And when that resistance is held, it slowly turns into something heavier, resentment. It does not always appear as anger. Sometimes it is silent. It lives in the way distance begins to grow, in the way warmth becomes guarded, in the way past moments are replayed with a quiet sense of disappointment. This is where emotional strain begins to build, because holding resentment requires energy. It keeps the mind tied to what has already happened, to what cannot be changed, to what was expected but not received. And over time, this creates a sense of separation, not just from others, but from peace. There is another way of seeing this. It begins with a simple but difficult recognition. People are incomplete, not as a flaw, but as a condition. They carry their own limitations, their own blind spots, their own fears, their own ways of understanding the world. Their ability to love, to listen, to respond is shaped by these things. And because of that, their actions will never fully match what is hoped for. Not consistently, not perfectly. This realization can feel disappointing at first, because it removes the expectation of complete fulfillment from others. But within that removal, something important appears: freedom. When people are allowed to be incomplete without needing them to meet every expectation, the pressure begins to dissolve. The need to correct, to change, to make them behave differently in order to feel at ease, begins to fade. This does not mean accepting harmful behavior. It means seeing clearly what others are capable of without adding expectation on top of it. This clarity changes the way interactions are experienced. Instead of measuring people against an ideal, they are seen as they are. This reduces friction, because the mind is no longer comparing reality to an imagined standard. There is also a shift in how disappointment is felt. Disappointment still arises, but it is softer. It is not fueled by the belief that something was owed. It is simply a recognition that something was not present. This makes it easier to let go, because there is no longer a need to hold on to what should have been. There is also a quiet compassion that begins to develop, not forced, not artificial, but natural. When people are seen as incomplete, their actions are understood in a different way. Not excused, but placed in context. This reduces judgment. Judgment often comes from expectation. When expectation softens, judgment follows. This creates more space in relationships, space where people can exist without being constantly evaluated, space where interaction can happen without the need for perfection. There is also a change in how hurt is processed. When someone fails to meet an expectation, the immediate reaction is often to interpret it personally, to see it as a reflection of value, of importance, of worth. But when incompleteness is understood, this interpretation begins to shift. The action is seen more as a reflection of the other person's limitations, rather than a statement about oneself. This reduces the intensity of the hurt, not by avoiding it, but by understanding it differently. There is also a deeper layer to this shift. The need for others to complete what is missing internally begins to dissolve. The expectation that someone else should fill every emotional gap fades. This creates independence, not isolation, but a stable internal base that does not rely on others to function. Relationships become something that adds to life, rather than something that must sustain it completely. This changes the nature of connection. Connection becomes lighter, less burdened by expectation, less strained by the need for perfection. There is more room for authenticity, for natural interaction, for presence without pressure. There is also a reduction in control. When people are allowed to be incomplete, there is less need to shape their behavior. Less effort is spent trying to make them respond in a certain way. This reduces tension. It also increases respect, because allowing someone to be as they are without constant correction acknowledges their autonomy. This creates a more balanced dynamic. There is also a shift in how forgiveness is experienced. Forgiveness becomes easier when expectation is reduced, not because the action is justified, but because the need to hold on to it weakens. The mind is no longer anchored to the idea that something should have been different. This allows for release of tension, of replaying, of holding on to past moments. This creates more space for the present. There is also a change in how closeness is felt. Closeness is no longer dependent on perfect understanding or perfect behavior. It is found in shared presence, in moments of connection that do not need to meet a specific standard. This creates a more sustainable form of intimacy, one that can exist even with imperfection. There is also a deeper sense of acceptance, not passive but aware, an acceptance that people will act according to their nature, their understanding, their limitations. This does not remove the ability to set boundaries. It clarifies it. Boundaries are no longer set from resentment, but from understanding. This makes them more effective, more stable. There is also a quiet strength that begins to form, a strength that comes from not needing others to be different in order to feel at ease. The ability to remain steady even when others fall short. This strength is not rigid, it is flexible, open, grounded. There is also a shift in how expectations are formed. Expectations become more realistic, more aligned with what is actually possible. This reduces disappointment and increases clarity. There is also a reduction in emotional volatility. Without the constant cycle of expectation and disappointment, emotions become more stable. There is less fluctuation, less intensity. This creates a calmer internal state. There is also a deeper appreciation for what is present. When perfection is no longer expected, what is available becomes more noticeable. Small gestures, simple moments become more meaningful. This increases gratitude. There is also a change in how absence is experienced. Absence is no longer interpreted as failure. It is seen as part of the natural variation in human behavior. This reduces anxiety. There is also a deeper connection to reality. People are seen as they are, not as they should be. This creates a more honest experience of relationships. There is also a shift in how effort is given. Effort is no longer based on the expectation of return. It becomes an expression of intention, not a transaction. This creates cleaner interactions. There is also a sense of ease that begins to grow. Ease that comes from not holding others to impossible standards. Ease that comes from allowing imperfection to exist. Over time, this becomes natural. The need to correct, to judge, to resent begins to fade. What remains is a quieter, more stable way of relating, a way that does not depend on others being complete, a way that allows for connection without pressure. And within this way of being, something important becomes clear. Peace is not found in perfect people. It is found in the ability to remain open, even when people are imperfect. This realization changes the way relationships are experienced. They become less heavy, less demanding, more free. And in that freedom, something gentle begins to take shape. A connection that does not need perfection to exist. A connection that is steady even in the presence of incompleteness. And as the heart begins to relax around people, no longer demanding perfection, another pattern quietly comes into focus. Even when others are allowed to be incomplete, the mind can still be holding tightly to something else. Not people this time, but outcomes. The way things should unfold, the way situations should resolve, the way the future should take shape. It is a quieter form of holding, but it runs deep, because control often feels like safety. There is a certain tension that lives beneath the surface of daily life. It shows up in planning, in predicting, in trying to stay one step ahead of what might happen next. It feels responsible, even necessary, to think through possibilities, to prepare, to manage. But beneath that effort, there is often something else. Fear. Fear that if things are not controlled, they might fall apart. Fear that uncertainty will lead to discomfort, that unpredictability will create instability. So the mind begins to tighten around outcomes, trying to shape them before they arrive. This tightening creates a sense of fragility, because when control becomes the source of stability, anything outside of that control becomes a threat. Unexpected changes feel larger than they are. Small disruptions carry more weight. The mind becomes sensitive, reactive, easily unsettled. It is not because life is more difficult. It is because the grip is too tight. There is a different way of relating to this. It begins with loosening, not abandoning responsibility, not ignoring what needs to be done, but softening the attachment to how things must turn out. This creates space, space where the mind is no longer bracing against every possibility. When control is loosened, something unexpected happens. The mind becomes less fragile, not weaker but more resilient, because it is no longer dependent on specific outcomes to remain stable. It can move with change instead of resisting it. It can adapt without collapsing. This adaptability is a form of strength. It allows for flexibility, for responsiveness, for a more grounded way of engaging with life. Instead of trying to predict every outcome, there is a willingness to meet whatever arises. This reduces fear, because fear often comes from the unknown, from the inability to control what is coming next. When the need for control is reduced, the unknown becomes less threatening. It is still uncertain, but it is no longer overwhelming. There is also a shift in how planning is approached. Planning does not disappear, but it becomes lighter. It is no longer an attempt to secure certainty, but a way to prepare while remaining open. This creates a balance between action and acceptance. There is also a change in how mistakes are experienced. When control is tight, mistakes feel like failures. They are seen as evidence that something went wrong, that the plan was not followed correctly. This creates pressure. Without that tight control, mistakes are seen differently. They become part of the process. Not something to avoid at all costs, but something that can be learned from without destabilizing the sense of self. This reduces anxiety and supports growth. There is also a deeper layer to this shift. The identity that was built around being in control begins to loosen. The idea that stability comes from managing every detail starts to fade. This creates space for a different kind of stability, one that comes from within, not from external conditions. This internal stability is not rigid. It is flexible, open, responsive. It allows for movement, for change, for uncertainty without creating panic. There is also a reduction in overthinking. Overthinking is often driven by the need to control outcomes. The mind tries to anticipate every possibility, to prepare for every scenario. This creates loops of thought that are difficult to exit. When control is loosened, these loops begin to slow. Not because thinking stops, but because the urgency behind it fades. There is less need to solve everything in advance. This creates mental space, space where thoughts can arise and pass without being chased. There is also a shift in how time is experienced. When control is tight, the future carries a lot of weight. It becomes something that must be secured, something that must be shaped in a certain way. This creates pressure. Without that pressure, the present becomes more accessible. Attention returns to what is happening now rather than constantly projecting forward. This increases clarity and reduces stress. There is also a change in how uncertainty is felt. Uncertainty is no longer something to avoid. It becomes something that can be tolerated, even accepted. This creates resilience. Resilience is not about avoiding difficulty. It is about being able to move through it without breaking. Loosening control supports this. Because the mind is not rigid, it can adjust. It can respond to changes without collapsing. There is also a deeper sense of trust that begins to develop. Not blind trust, but a grounded confidence in the ability to handle what arises. This reduces the need to control, because there is an understanding that even if things do not go as planned, they can still be managed. There is also a shift in how effort is experienced. Effort is no longer tied to guaranteed results. It becomes something that is offered without attachment to outcome. This reduces pressure and increases freedom. There is also a reduction in frustration. Frustration often comes from the gap between expectation and reality. When control is loosened, that gap becomes less significant. This reduces tension. There is also a change in how success is perceived. Success is no longer defined by perfect outcomes. It becomes about engagement, about presence, about the quality of action. This creates a more sustainable form of motivation. There is also a deeper connection to the flow of life. Life is no longer something to be controlled. It becomes something to move with. This creates a different experience, one that is less rigid, more open. There is also a quiet ease that begins to appear. Ease that comes from not needing everything to be a certain way. Ease that comes from allowing change. Ease that comes from trusting the process. Over time, this becomes natural. The grip loosens, the mind softens, the sense of fragility fades, and within that shift, something important becomes clear. Strength does not come from controlling everything. It comes from being able to remain steady when things are not controlled. This is a different kind of strength, one that is quiet but powerful, one that does not depend on conditions, one that remains even when the unexpected happens. And from this place, life begins to feel different, less tense, less fragile, more resilient, more free. And as the grip on control begins to loosen and the mind learns to move without needing to shape every outcome, something even more subtle begins to rise into awareness. The tension is no longer in events, no longer in people, no longer in the future. It begins to reveal itself in something deeper, something quieter, something tied to identity itself, a quiet need, a need not just to live, but to be remembered. There is a feeling that moves silently through many moments. It is not always spoken, but it is often present. A desire to leave something behind, to be noticed, to be seen in a way that lasts beyond the moment. Not just to exist, but to matter in a way that echoes. It shows up in small ways, in the way a person hopes their words stay with someone after a conversation ends. In the way effort is sometimes tied to recognition that will be remembered. In the quiet discomfort when presence feels unnoticed, when absence feels invisible. It is not always about fame or large achievements. Often it is much more personal, a wish to be remembered by someone, a wish to leave an impression, a wish to not fade quietly. This wish can feel natural. It can even feel meaningful. But beneath it, there is a subtle form of attachment, an attachment to permanence in a world that does not offer it. Because everything changes. Moments pass, conversations fade, memories soften, even strong impressions eventually dissolve, and when the need to be remembered is strong, this natural process becomes difficult to accept. There is a quiet resistance to fading, a discomfort with the idea that presence may not leave a lasting mark everywhere it goes. This resistance creates tension, because the mind begins to hold on to moments. It tries to make them significant, to ensure they are not lost, to create impact that will last. This effort can be subtle, but it requires energy. Energy that is spent not on living the moment, but on preserving it. This creates a form of bondage, not visible, not obvious, but deeply felt. Because now, presence is no longer enough. There is an added pressure to be remembered, to be noticed, to be significant. And when that does not happen, something feels incomplete. A conversation that fades quickly feels less valuable. An effort that is not recognized feels less meaningful. A presence that is not remembered feels diminished. This is where suffering begins, not because life is lacking, but because the expectation of lasting impact is not met. There is another way of relating to this. It begins with seeing clearly the nature of impermanence, not as a concept, but as a reality that touches everything. Every moment is temporary. Every interaction is passing. Every memory is subject to change. This is not a problem. It is the nature of existence. When this is seen deeply, something begins to shift. The need to hold on to moments starts to loosen, because there is an understanding that nothing needs to be preserved in order to be meaningful. Meaning does not come from duration. It comes from presence. This changes the way moments are experienced. Instead of trying to leave a mark, there is a focus on being fully present. The value of the moment is not measured by how long it will be remembered, but by how deeply it is lived. This creates a different kind of engagement, one that is not driven by the need for impact, but by the quality of presence. There is also a shift in how identity is experienced. Identity is no longer tied to how one is remembered by others. It becomes something more internal, more stable, less dependent on external memory. This reduces pressure, because there is no longer a need to ensure that every action leaves a trace. Actions can be taken without the burden of significance. This creates freedom. Freedom to speak without needing to impress. Freedom to act without needing to be remembered. Freedom to exist without needing to leave a permanent mark. There is also a change in how silence is experienced. Silence is no longer uncomfortable because it leaves no trace. It becomes a space of presence, a space where nothing needs to be recorded or remembered. This creates ease. There is also a deeper layer to this shift. The ego begins to soften, not disappear, but become less dominant. Because the ego often seeks continuity. It wants to extend itself through memory, through impact, through recognition. When the need to be remembered weakens, this drive becomes less intense. This creates a lighter sense of self, a self that does not need to extend beyond the present moment in order to feel valid. There is also a reduction in comparison. The need to measure impact against others fades, because the focus is no longer on lasting impression. It is on immediate experience. This reduces tension. There is also a change in how effort is experienced. Effort is no longer tied to legacy. It becomes something that is expressed in the moment, without the need for it to be remembered. This creates a cleaner form of action. There is also a shift in how relationships are experienced. Connections are no longer used as a way to secure memory. They become spaces of shared presence, without the need to ensure that one is remembered in a certain way. This reduces pressure. There is also a deeper appreciation for impermanence, not as loss, but as freedom. Because if nothing needs to last forever, there is less need to control, to preserve, to hold on to. This creates space. Space for moments to arise and pass naturally. There is also a quiet acceptance that begins to grow. Acceptance that being forgotten in some spaces does not reduce value. Acceptance that presence does not need to be recorded to be real. This reduces fear. There is also a change in how time is experienced. Time is no longer something to leave marks on. It becomes something to move through. This creates a more fluid experience. There is also a deeper sense of humility, not in a diminishing way, but in a grounding way. A recognition that life is not centered around personal impact. This creates balance. There is also a shift in how satisfaction is felt. Satisfaction is no longer tied to recognition. It is felt in the act itself, in the presence within the moment. This creates a more stable sense of fulfillment. There is also a reduction in anxiety, because there is no longer a need to ensure that every moment counts in a lasting way. This reduces pressure. There is also a deeper connection to simplicity. Moments do not need to be significant. They can be simple and still complete. This creates peace. There is also a quiet strength that begins to appear. a strength that comes from not needing to be remembered. The ability to exist fully in the moment without extending beyond it. This strength is not loud, it is steady. There is also a deeper sense of freedom. Freedom from the need to leave a mark, freedom from the pressure of significance, freedom to simply be. And within this freedom, something important becomes clear. Life does not need to remember you for it to be meaningful. Moments do not need to last for them to be complete. Presence is enough. And when this is felt deeply, the need to be remembered begins to dissolve. What remains is something lighter, something quieter, something free, a way of living that does not reach beyond the moment, but fully arrives within it. And as the need to be remembered begins to fade, and the weight of leaving a mark in every space quietly dissolves, something even deeper comes into view. The mind no longer reaches into the future to secure significance, but there is still a subtle movement that remains. A quieter search, not for memory this time, but for certainty. A desire to feel safe in what is coming, to know that things will hold, that people will stay, that plans will unfold without disruption. It is not loud, but it is persistent, a silent pull toward emotional guarantees. There is a feeling that often goes unnoticed because it feels reasonable. The desire to know where things are going, to feel secure in relationships, to trust that effort will lead to stable outcomes. It seems natural to want assurance, to want something to hold on to. But beneath this desire, there is a subtle form of tension, because life does not offer guarantees, not in relationships, not in plans, not in routines. Everything carries uncertainty. Everything moves, shifts, changes over time. And when the mind tries to secure certainty from something that is inherently unstable, it creates pressure. This pressure is often mistaken for care. The need to check, to confirm, to seek reassurance. The quiet habit of looking for signs that things are still safe, still intact, still reliable. It can appear as attention, as involvement, as concern, but beneath it there is fear. Fear of loss, fear of change, fear of not knowing what comes next. This fear drives the search for guarantees, and the more the mind searches, the more it becomes aware of how little can actually be secured. This creates a loop. The need for certainty increases, but the ability to find it does not. This is where restlessness begins. Not because life is unstable, but because the mind is trying to force stability where it cannot exist. This creates a constant background tension. There is another way of relating to this. It begins with a quiet acceptance, not of chaos, but of uncertainty. A recognition that not everything can be known in advance. That not every relationship can promise permanence. That not every plan will unfold as expected. This acceptance does not create instability, it creates space. Space where the mind no longer needs to secure the future before allowing peace. Space where the present moment is not overshadowed by what might happen next. This shift is subtle but powerful, because it removes the need to chase something that cannot be caught. When emotional guarantees are no longer pursued, the mind begins to settle. The constant scanning for reassurance slows. The need to confirm every detail fades. This creates calm, not because everything is certain, but because certainty is no longer required for peace. There is also a shift in how relationships are experienced. Without the need for guarantees, connection becomes lighter. There is less pressure to define everything, to secure every feeling, to ensure that nothing will change. This allows for a more natural flow. People can be present without needing to promise permanence. Interactions can unfold without being measured against future expectations. This creates a different kind of closeness, one that is not built on certainty, but on presence. There is also a reduction in anxiety, because anxiety often comes from the attempt to control what is uncertain. When that attempt is released, the mind becomes less reactive. It no longer needs to predict every outcome. This creates mental space. Space where thoughts can arise without being chased. Space where the unknown is not immediately treated as a threat. There is also a deeper layer to this shift. The identity that depends on security begins to loosen. The idea that stability must come from external conditions fades. This creates internal stability, a stability that is not dependent on guarantees, but on the ability to remain steady in their absence. This is a different kind of strength. Not rigid, not defensive, but open and resilient. There is also a change in how plans are approached. Plans are still made, but they are held lightly. There is an understanding that they may change, and that this is not a failure. This reduces frustration, because the mind is no longer attached to a fixed outcome. There is also a shift in how time is experienced. The future carries less weight. It is no longer something that must be secured before peace can be felt. This brings attention back to the present. This increases awareness. Moments are experienced more fully, without being overshadowed by what is uncertain. There is also a change in how loss is perceived. Loss is no longer something that must be prevented at all costs. It is seen as part of the natural movement of life. This does not remove pain, but it reduces fear, because fear is often tied to the attempt to avoid loss. When that attempt softens, the experience of life becomes more open. There is also a deeper sense of trust that begins to grow, not trust that everything will go well, but trust in the ability to handle what comes. This reduces the need for guarantees, because there is confidence in response, not in prediction. There is also a shift in how comfort is experienced. Comfort is no longer tied to certainty. It is found in presence, in awareness, in the ability to remain steady even when things are unclear. This creates a more stable form of ease. There is also a reduction in emotional dependence. The need for others to provide constant reassurance decreases. This creates more balanced relationships. Relationships are no longer used as a source of certainty. They become spaces of connection without the pressure of guaranteeing stability. There is also a deeper appreciation for what is present. Without chasing guarantees, the current moment becomes enough. This increases satisfaction. There is also a change in how uncertainty is felt. Uncertainty becomes something that can be tolerated, even welcomed at times, because it allows for movement, for change, for possibility. This creates openness. There is also a quiet strength that begins to form, a strength that does not depend on knowing, the ability to remain calm without needing answers. This strength is not obvious, but it is steady. There is also a deeper sense of freedom. Freedom from the need to secure the future. Freedom from the constant search for reassurance. Freedom to live without guarantees. And within this freedom, something important becomes clear. Peace does not come from certainty. It comes from the ability to remain at ease in uncertainty. This realization changes the way life is experienced. Moments are no longer measured by how secure they feel. They are experienced as they are. This creates a lighter way of living, less driven by fear, less controlled by expectation, more open, more present, more free. And from this place, peace begins to grow, not slowly, but naturally, because nothing is being chased anymore. And as the need for emotional guarantees begins to loosen, and the mind learns to sit with uncertainty without reaching for reassurance, something deeper begins to rise from within. The future no longer needs to promise safety, but the past still holds a quiet grip. Because even when the mind stops chasing what will happen next, it often turns back toward what has already happened, searching, replaying, trying to complete something that feels unfinished. A question remains, not about the future this time, but about what never fully made sense. There is a kind of pain that does not come from the moment itself, but from the lack of resolution that follows it. Words that were never said, apologies that never came, explanations that were never given. These moments do not end cleanly. They stay open. And because they stay open, the mind keeps returning to them, trying to understand, trying to close the gap, trying to find something that will finally settle the feeling. There is a quiet belief that closure will bring peace, that once the right answer is found, once the right words are heard, once the situation is fully explained, something inside will finally relax. But often, that moment never comes. The person never explains, the apology never arrives, the reason remains unclear, and the mind continues to circle. This is where a different kind of suffering begins, not from the original wound, but from the constant attempt to complete it. The need for closure becomes its own form of attachment. An attachment to resolution, to answers, to something that may not be available. And the more the mind seeks it, the more it feels its absence. This creates tension, a subtle but persistent pull toward the past. A sense that something is unfinished, that something must be resolved before peace can be felt. But there is another way of relating to this. It begins with a quiet shift, a shift from needing closure to allowing incompleteness. Not because the wound no longer matters, but because the expectation of resolution is released. This does not happen instantly. It requires seeing clearly that some things will never be fully explained, that some people will never provide the clarity that is hoped for, that some experiences will remain open-ended. This realization can feel uncomfortable because it removes the possibility of a clean ending. But within that discomfort, something important begins to appear. Freedom. When the need for closure begins to dissolve, the mind no longer needs to return to the same moments repeatedly. The loop begins to weaken, not because the memory disappears, but because the demand for resolution is no longer driving it. This creates space. Space where the wound can exist without being constantly analyzed. Space where the feeling can be acknowledged without needing to be fixed. This changes the way pain is experienced. Pain is no longer tied to a question that must be answered. It becomes something that can be felt directly, without the added pressure of needing to understand it completely. This reduces suffering, because the mind is no longer holding on to the idea that something is missing. There is also a shift in how the past is viewed. The past is no longer something to be corrected. It is something that has already taken its shape. This reduces resistance. There is less argument with what has happened, less need to rewrite it in order to feel at ease. There is also a deeper layer to this shift. The identity that is tied to unresolved pain begins to loosen. The idea that one is defined by what has not been explained starts to fade. This creates space for a different sense of self, one that is not anchored to the need for answers. There is also a change in how forgiveness is experienced. Forgiveness becomes less about receiving something from the other person and more about releasing the need to receive it. This creates independence, because peace is no longer dependent on someone else's action. There is also a reduction in emotional reactivity. When the need for closure is strong, certain memories can trigger intense reactions. Without that need, the intensity begins to soften, not disappear, but become more manageable. There is also a shift in how time is experienced. The past loses some of its hold. Attention returns more easily to the present. This increases presence. There is also a deeper acceptance that begins to grow. Acceptance that not everything will be resolved, that some questions will remain unanswered. This acceptance does not remove meaning, it removes the pressure. There is also a change in how expectations are formed. Expectations for explanation, for apology, for resolution begin to fade. This reduces disappointment. There is also a quiet strength that begins to form, a strength that comes from being able to carry an open wound without needing to close it, the ability to live fully, even when something remains incomplete. This strength is not obvious, but it is steady. There is also a deeper sense of compassion, not only toward others, but toward oneself, because there is recognition that the need for closure is natural. But it is not necessary for peace. There is also a shift in how healing is understood. Healing is no longer seen as something that comes from external resolution. It becomes something that develops internally, through acceptance, through presence, through allowing. There is also a reduction in overthinking. The loops that come from trying to solve the past begin to slow, because the mind is no longer searching for a final answer. This creates mental space. There is also a deeper connection to reality. Reality that includes incompleteness, that includes unanswered questions, that includes open endings. This creates a more honest experience of life. There is also a change in how emotional energy is used. Energy is no longer spent chasing explanations. It becomes available for presence, for awareness, for engagement with the current moment. There is also a quieter relationship with memory. Memories can arise without needing to be resolved. They can be felt and allowed to pass. This reduces their hold. There is also a deeper sense of peace that begins to appear. Not because everything is resolved, but because the need for resolution has softened. This peace is subtle, but it is stable. There is also a sense of release, a release from the constant pull of the past, a release from the need to complete what cannot be completed. This creates freedom. Freedom to move forward without carrying the weight of unfinished explanations. Freedom to exist without needing every part of life to make sense. And within this freedom, something important becomes clear. Closure is not always given, but peace can still be found, not through answers, not through apologies, but through the quiet decision to stop demanding them. This decision changes everything, because it removes a fundamental source of tension, the belief that something must be resolved before life can continue. Without that belief, the path becomes clearer, not because it is fully understood, but because it is no longer blocked by the need for understanding. And from this place, something gentle begins to grow. A peace that does not depend on endings. A peace that exists even in the presence of open wounds. A peace that is not forced, but allowed. And as the mind slowly releases its grip on the past, no longer waiting for answers that may never come, another quiet attachment begins to reveal itself. It is not tied to people this time, not tied to closure, but to something more visible, more accepted, more rarely questioned, the relationship with what is owned. Because even when the heart becomes lighter, the environment around it can still carry a hidden weight. A weight built not from pain, but from accumulation. From the belief that comfort, security, and satisfaction can be built by adding more. And at first it seems to work. There is a small lift when something new is gained. A sense of improvement, of progress, of having moved closer to something better. But that feeling does not stay. It fades. And when it fades, something else appears. A quiet need for more. There is a subtle pattern that forms over time. The mind begins to associate peace with having the right conditions, the right objects, the right level of comfort. It creates a connection between external possession and internal state. This connection feels logical. If the environment is improved, the experience should improve. If comfort increases, satisfaction should follow. But this relationship is not stable, because what is gained externally does not settle internally in a lasting way. The mind adapts. What once felt like enough begins to feel normal. What once felt valuable begins to feel expected. And slowly, without noticing, the baseline shifts. More becomes necessary. Not always in large ways, sometimes in small, quiet adjustments. A slightly better version, a slightly more comfortable setting, a slightly higher standard, and each adjustment feels justified. But together, they create a pattern of dependence. Dependence on external conditions to maintain internal ease. This creates a form of subtle tension, because now peace is no longer something that exists independently. It becomes something that must be supported by what is owned. This creates fragility. If conditions change, if comfort is reduced, if something is lost, the sense of ease is affected. Not because the loss is significant, but because the dependency has been formed. There is another way of relating to this. It begins with seeing clearly how accumulation can crowd the inner space, not physically but mentally. Every possession carries a small weight, a responsibility, an expectation, a connection. Individually they seem light, but together they create density, a sense of being surrounded, filled, occupied. This reduces clarity, because attention is spread across what is owned. There is less space for stillness, less space for quiet, less space for awareness. This is not about rejecting comfort, it is about understanding its limits. Comfort can support life, but it cannot replace inner stability. When this is seen clearly, something begins to shift. The need to accumulate begins to soften, not as a forced discipline, but as a natural response to understanding. Because the mind recognizes that more does not lead to lasting peace, this creates space. Space that is not filled with objects, but with presence. Space where attention is not constantly pulled outward. This allows for a different kind of richness, a richness that is not based on quantity, but on clarity. Clarity that comes from simplicity. When there is less to manage, less to maintain, less to protect, the mind becomes lighter. It is not occupied by constant interaction with what is owned. It becomes available for observation, for reflection, for simply being. This availability changes the quality of experience. Moments are no longer filtered through layers of possession. They are experienced more directly. This creates a deeper connection to the present. There is also a shift in how satisfaction is felt. Satisfaction is no longer tied to gaining something new. It is found in what is already present. This reduces the cycle of desire. The constant movement toward more begins to slow. There is also a deeper layer to this shift. The identity that is tied to what is owned begins to loosen. The idea that value comes from accumulation fades. This creates a more stable sense of self, one that is not dependent on external markers. There is also a change in how loss is experienced. When attachment to possessions is strong, loss feels significant, not just practically, but emotionally. Without that attachment, loss becomes simpler. It is still acknowledged, but it does not disrupt the internal state in the same way. This creates resilience that comes from not being tied to what can change. There is also a reduction in comparison. Without the focus on accumulation, there is less need to measure against others. This reduces tension. There is also a shift in how comfort is understood. Comfort is no longer something that must be maximized. It becomes something that is appreciated, but not required. This creates flexibility, the ability to remain at ease in different conditions. There is also a deeper sense of gratitude, not because more is gained, but because less is needed. This changes the way value is perceived. Small things become enough. Simple moments carry weight. There is also a change in how time is used. Less time is spent managing possessions. More time becomes available. This creates space for reflection, for awareness, for connection. There is also a deeper connection to inner experience. Without the distraction of constant acquisition, attention turns inward. This allows for a richer understanding of the mind, of emotions, of presence. There is also a reduction in desire, not suppression, but a natural decrease. Because the link between possession and peace has been seen as limited. This reduces restlessness. There is also a quieter environment, not just physically, but mentally. Fewer attachments create fewer disturbances. This supports calm. There is also a deeper sense of freedom. Freedom from needing more. Freedom from maintaining excess. Freedom from being tied to what is owned. This freedom is not dramatic, but it is steady. There is also a change in how value is experienced. Value is no longer placed in accumulation. It is found in simplicity, in clarity, in presence. There is also a deeper appreciation for what is essential. What is needed becomes clearer. What is unnecessary begins to fall away. This creates focus. There is also a reduction in fear. Fear of loss decreases because there is less to lose and less attachment to what is lost. There is also a quiet strength that begins to appear, a strength that comes from not needing external support to feel complete. The ability to remain steady regardless of what is owned. This strength is not visible, but it is stable. There is also a deeper sense of peace, not because everything is perfect, but because less is required. This peace is simple but complete. There is also a shift in how life is experienced. Life becomes less about acquiring, more about being. This creates a different rhythm, a slower, more grounded pace. There is also a deeper connection to reality. Reality that is not filtered through desire, but seen as it is. This creates clarity. Over time, this becomes natural. The need for more fades. The attachment to possession weakens. The inner space expands. And within that space, something important becomes clear. Richness is not created by accumulation. It is revealed by simplicity. Because when less is required from the outside, more becomes available inside. More clarity, more calm, more presence, more freedom. And from this place, life begins to feel different. Not fuller in quantity, but deeper in experience. And in that depth, something quietly returns. A sense of enough. And as life becomes lighter through needing less from what is owned, and the mind begins to rest in simplicity rather than accumulation, another quiet space begins to open. It is not filled with things, not filled with noise, not filled with constant interaction. It is a space many people try to avoid, the space of being alone, because even when possessions no longer define peace, there is still a deep instinct that reacts when silence stretches too long, when presence is not shared, when the environment feels empty of others. Something inside begins to move, a subtle discomfort, a quiet unease, a feeling that something is missing. Loneliness is often treated like a signal that something is wrong, not just a feeling, but a problem that must be solved quickly. The moment it appears, the mind looks for ways to remove it, to fill the space, to reach out, to distract, to escape. It feels urgent, as if staying in that state for too long might lead to something deeper, something heavier, so the reaction becomes immediate. A message is sent, a screen is opened, noise is introduced, anything to avoid the stillness. But beneath this reaction, there is a belief that being alone means being incomplete, that solitude is proof of absence, that without connection in that moment, something essential is lacking. This belief creates pressure because it turns a natural state into an emergency. And when something is treated as an emergency, the body responds. Tension rises. Restlessness increases. The mind becomes active, searching for a solution. This creates a cycle. Loneliness appears. It is resisted. It is avoided. And in that avoidance, it becomes something more intense. There is another way of relating to this. It begins with a quiet shift. A shift from seeing loneliness as a problem to seeing it as a space. Not a space of lack, but a space of potential. When solitude is no longer treated as something to escape, it begins to reveal something different. It becomes a place where the mind can settle, a place where attention is not pulled outward, a place where presence can deepen. This shift is not immediate because the habit of avoiding loneliness is strong. But with awareness, something begins to change. The initial discomfort is noticed without reacting. The urge to fill the space is seen without being followed. This creates a pause, and in that pause, something new becomes possible. The feeling is allowed, not pushed away, not solved, just experienced. At first, this may feel unfamiliar, because the mind is used to movement, to distraction, to interaction. But as the moment is allowed to unfold, the intensity begins to change. What once felt urgent begins to soften. What once felt heavy becomes lighter. This is not because the feeling disappears, but because it is no longer resisted. Resistance often amplifies emotion. Without it, the experience becomes simpler. Loneliness becomes just a feeling, not a signal of failure, not a sign of absence. Just a state that arises and passes. This creates space. Space where the mind is not constantly seeking connection to feel complete. Space where the self can exist without external reinforcement. This is where something deeper begins to develop. A sense of wholeness, not built from interaction, but from presence. The ability to sit with oneself without discomfort, to exist without needing constant input, to feel complete even in silence. This is a different kind of strength. Not loud, not visible, but steady. There is also a shift in how connection is experienced. When loneliness is no longer treated as an emergency, relationships become lighter. They are no longer used to fill a gap. They become spaces of sharing, not of dependence. This creates healthier connections. Connections that are not driven by need, but by choice. There is also a reduction in anxiety, because the fear of being alone decreases. The mind no longer sees solitude as something to avoid at all costs. This creates calm. There is also a deeper layer to this shift. The identity that is tied to constant connection begins to loosen. The idea that one must always be engaged, always be interacting, always be connected, fades. This creates independence, not isolation, but the ability to stand alone without feeling incomplete. There is also a change in how time is experienced. Time alone is no longer something to fill, it becomes something to inhabit. This creates a richer experience. There is also a deeper connection to the inner world. Without external distraction, attention turns inward. This allows for observation, for reflection, for understanding. This builds awareness, awareness that is not available when the mind is constantly occupied. There is also a reduction in distraction, because the need to escape loneliness decreases. This creates clarity. There is also a shift in how silence is experienced. Silence is no longer uncomfortable. It becomes a space of rest, a space where nothing needs to be done. This supports calm. There is also a deeper sense of acceptance, acceptance of being alone at times, acceptance that connection is not constant. This reduces resistance. There is also a change in how emotions are processed. Without distraction, emotions are felt more directly. This allows them to move naturally. This reduces build-up. There is also a quiet strength that begins to form, a strength that comes from being able to sit with oneself, the ability to remain steady without external input. This strength is subtle but powerful. There is also a deeper sense of freedom. Freedom from needing constant connection, freedom from the fear of being alone, freedom to exist in silence. There is also a change in how presence is experienced. Presence becomes deeper, more grounded, more complete. There is also a reduction in comparison. The need to measure one's level of connection against others fades. This reduces tension. There is also a deeper appreciation for simple moments, moments that do not involve others, moments that are quiet, still, unshared. These moments become valuable. There is also a shift in how fulfillment is felt. Fulfillment is no longer tied to interaction. It is found in presence. This creates stability. There is also a deeper trust that begins to grow. Trust in the ability to be alone without losing balance. This reduces fear. There is also a change in how connection is approached. Connection becomes something that is entered into from a place of fullness, not from a place of lack. This creates healthier dynamics. There is also a deeper sense of peace, not because loneliness disappears, but because it is no longer resisted. This peace is quiet but stable. Over time, this becomes natural. The urgency fades, the reaction softens, the space becomes familiar, and within that space, something important becomes clear. Loneliness is not an emergency. It is an invitation to return inward, to sit with oneself, to discover a sense of wholeness that does not depend on others. And when this invitation is accepted, something begins to grow, a quiet completeness, a steady presence, a freedom that does not fear silence. And from this place, life begins to feel different, not more connected, but more whole. And as solitude becomes less threatening and the heart learns to rest in its own presence without rushing outward for completion, another layer quietly begins to unfold. The fear of being alone fades, but something more subtle remains, a quiet need, not just to connect, not just to be seen, but to be seen in a certain way, to be different, to be chosen, to be above the ordinary. It does not always speak loudly, but it shapes many thoughts, many decisions, many emotional reactions. Because even when the mind no longer fears silence, it may still seek distinction. There is a feeling that arises when someone else is noticed more, appreciated more, chosen more. A subtle tightening, not always acknowledged, but present. A question begins to form. Why not me? This question carries weight, not because it seeks understanding, but because it reflects a deeper attachment, an attachment to being special. Being special does not always mean wanting fame or attention in obvious ways. It can be much quieter, a desire to be irreplaceable in someone's life, a wish to be the one person who stands out, a hope that one's presence carries a unique importance. These desires feel natural. They seem to add meaning, to give direction, to create a sense of identity. But beneath them, there is a fragile structure. Because when identity is built on being special, it becomes dependent on comparison, and comparison creates instability. Someone else's success becomes a threat. Someone else's recognition feels like a loss. Even in moments of peace, there is a quiet tension, a need to maintain a certain position, to remain distinct, to not fade into the ordinary. This creates pressure, pressure to stand out, pressure to be different, pressure to be more. And when this pressure is not met, something inside begins to feel unsettled. Not because anything is wrong, but because the identity being held is fragile. It requires constant reinforcement. There is another way of relating to this. It begins with a quiet recognition. The need to be special is not the same as the need to be real. When the mind seeks to be special, it often moves away from simplicity. It creates layers, expectations, comparisons, all of which add weight. But when the need to be special softens, something else becomes possible. A return to what is already present, a return to being without needing to stand out. This return is not a loss. It is a release from the constant effort to maintain distinction. This creates ease, because the mind no longer needs to measure itself against others. It no longer needs to secure a unique position. It can simply exist. There is a quiet freedom in this. Freedom from comparison, freedom from competition, freedom from the need to prove something. This does not remove individuality, it removes the attachment to it. There is a difference. Individuality exists naturally. It does not need to be forced. It does not need to be defended. When the need to be special is released, individuality becomes lighter, more authentic, less driven by external validation. There is also a shift in how relationships are experienced. Without the need to be the most important, connection becomes more open. There is less pressure to be chosen above others, less need to secure a unique place. This creates more balanced interactions. There is also a reduction in jealousy, because jealousy often comes from comparison, from the belief that someone else's value reduces one's own. Without the need to be special, this belief weakens. This creates peace. There is also a deeper layer to this shift. The identity that was built around distinction begins to loosen. The idea that worth depends on being exceptional fades. This creates stability, a stability that is not dependent on external recognition. There is also a change in how success is perceived. Success is no longer about standing out. It becomes about alignment, about living in a way that feels true. This reduces pressure. There is also a shift in how failure is experienced. Failure is no longer seen as a loss of status. It becomes an event, something that happens, not something that defines. This creates resilience. There is also a deeper sense of belonging, not because one is special, but because one is part of something larger. This creates connection. There is also a reduction in performance. The need to appear a certain way fades. This creates authenticity. There is also a change in how attention is experienced. Attention is no longer something to seek constantly. It becomes something that can be received without attachment. This creates balance. There is also a deeper appreciation for the ordinary. Moments that are simple, quiet, unremarkable. These moments become enough. This creates contentment. There is also a shift in how identity is experienced. Identity becomes less fixed, less tied to labels, more fluid. This creates openness. There is also a reduction in fear, fear of being overlooked, fear of not being chosen. These fears weaken. There is also a deeper sense of peace, not because one is recognized, but because recognition is no longer required. This peace is steady. There is also a quiet strength that begins to form, a strength that comes from not needing to stand out, the ability to exist without comparison. This strength is subtle but stable. There is also a deeper connection to reality, reality that includes both uniqueness and sameness. This creates balance. There is also a shift in how value is perceived. Value is no longer placed in distinction. It is found in presence. This creates clarity. There is also a reduction in tension. Because the mind is no longer trying to maintain a position, this creates ease. There is also a deeper sense of freedom. Freedom from needing to be special. Freedom to be ordinary. Freedom to exist without comparison. And within this freedom, something important becomes clear. Peace is not found in being above others. It is found in no longer needing to be. This realization changes everything because it removes a fundamental source of suffering, the belief that one must be exceptional to be enough. Without that belief, life becomes simpler, more grounded, more real, and in that simplicity, something quietly returns, a sense of ease, a sense of presence, a sense of enough. Not because one is special, but because nothing more is needed. And as the need to be special begins to fade, and life no longer has to prove your importance through distinction, something else quietly begins to soften. The pressure to stand out is gone, but another expectation still lingers. The expectation of how happiness should feel. Because even when the mind stops comparing, it can still demand that joy arrives in a certain way. Not small, not quiet, not ordinary, but strong, exciting, noticeable. Something that feels like a clear signal. Something that confirms that life is good. There is a subtle disappointment that appears when moments are calm instead of thrilling, when happiness does not come with intensity, when it does not stand out clearly against everything else. The mind begins to question it. Is this really it? Shouldn't it feel bigger? Shouldn't it be more? This questioning creates distance, distance from what is already present. Because the mind is looking for something more vivid, something more defined, something that matches its idea of what joy should look like. And in doing so, it overlooks what is already there. There is a quiet kind of joy that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with excitement. It does not demand attention. It is simple. It exists in ordinary moments, in a calm breath, in a steady rhythm, in the absence of disturbance. But this kind of joy is often ignored, not because it is not enough, but because it does not match expectation. The mind is conditioned to look for peaks, for highs, for moments that stand out. And when those moments are not present, it assumes something is missing. This creates a subtle dissatisfaction, a feeling that life is not quite right, not because it is lacking, but because it is not intense enough. There is another way of relating to this. It begins with allowing joy to be small, not lowering standards, not settling, but recognizing that contentment does not need to be loud to be real. When this is understood, something begins to shift. The need for intensity softens. The expectation of constant excitement fades. This creates space. Space where quiet moments can be felt more fully. Space where simple experiences are no longer overlooked. This changes the way happiness is experienced. Happiness becomes less about peaks and more about steadiness. Less about intensity and more about presence. This creates a more stable form of joy. Because it is not dependent on rare moments, it is available in ordinary ones. There is also a shift in how the mind responds to calmness. Calmness is no longer seen as emptiness. It becomes something valuable, something to rest in. This reduces restlessness. There is also a deeper layer to this shift. The identity that is tied to excitement begins to loosen. The idea that life must feel intense to be meaningful fades. This creates balance, a balance between movement and stillness. There is also a change in how time is experienced. Moments are no longer judged based on how stimulating they are. They are experienced as they are. This increases awareness. There is also a reduction in craving. Craving for more excitement, more stimulation, more intensity. This reduces tension. There is also a shift in how satisfaction is felt. Satisfaction becomes quieter, but more consistent. This creates stability. There is also a deeper appreciation for simplicity. Simple moments become enough. This creates contentment. There is also a change in how comparison is experienced. The need to compare experiences based on intensity fades. This reduces dissatisfaction. There is also a deeper connection to presence. Without the need for strong emotion, attention settles. This creates clarity. There is also a reduction in emotional swings. Highs and lows become less extreme. This creates balance. There is also a quiet strength that begins to form, a strength that comes from being able to rest in calmness, the ability to feel at ease without needing stimulation. This strength is subtle, but steady. There is also a deeper sense of peace, not because everything is exciting, but because nothing needs to be. This peace is quiet, but real. There is also a shift in how joy is recognized. Joy is no longer something to chase, it becomes something to notice. This changes the direction of attention, from seeking to observing. There is also a deeper sense of gratitude, not for big moments, but for small ones. This increases satisfaction. There is also a reduction in expectation. Expectation that happiness must look a certain way. This reduces pressure. There is also a change in how life is experienced. Life becomes less about reaching highs, more about being present. This creates ease. There is also a deeper connection to reality. Reality that includes both calm and excitement. This creates balance. There is also a shift in how fulfillment is felt. Fulfillment becomes steady, not dependent on intensity. This creates stability. There is also a reduction in restlessness. The need for constant stimulation fades. This creates calm. There is also a deeper sense of freedom. freedom from needing happiness to be loud, freedom to feel content in quiet moments, freedom to exist without chasing peaks. And within this freedom, something important becomes clear. Joy does not need to be intense to be real. It does not need to stand out to be enough. It can be small, plain, unannounced, and still complete. This realization changes everything, because it allows life to be lived without constant expectation, without constant searching, without constant comparison. And in that space, something gently appears. A quiet contentment, a steady ease, a simple joy that does not need to prove itself. And from this place, life begins to feel different, not more exciting, but more peaceful. And in that peace, something quietly settles. A sense of enough, exactly as it is. And as joy becomes quieter, no longer needing to be intense or dramatic to feel real, something else begins to loosen. The mind stops chasing emotional highs, but it can still be leaning forward, still reaching, not toward intensity this time, but toward something else, tomorrow. There is a subtle habit that continues even when life feels calm, a quiet movement of attention that keeps drifting ahead, placing hope, meaning, and relief somewhere in the future. Not here, not now, but later. There is a feeling that peace is almost within reach, just not yet. That something will settle once a certain point is reached. Once something changes, once something is achieved, once a certain condition is met. This creates a quiet delay, a delay in living, a delay in feeling complete. Because the present moment is no longer enough on its own. It becomes something to pass through, something to manage, something to endure until something better arrives. This is not always obvious. It can look like ambition, like planning, like hope. But beneath it, there is often a deeper pattern, a belief that the future holds what the present cannot provide. This belief creates distance from the moment that is already here, and in that distance, something begins to fade, the sense of presence, the ability to fully experience what is happening now. Because attention is always partially elsewhere, always leaning forward. This creates a subtle dissatisfaction, not because the present is lacking, but because it is being compared to what has not yet arrived. There is another way of relating to this. It begins with a quiet shift. A shift from placing everything in the future to allowing the present to carry its own weight. Not rejecting ambition, not abandoning goals, but releasing the idea that fulfillment depends on reaching them. When this shift begins, something changes. The future loses some of its grip. It is still there, still part of life, but it is no longer carrying the entire burden of hope. This creates space. Space where the present moment can be felt more fully. Space where life is not constantly postponed. There is a subtle form of postponement that happens when the mind is always focused on what comes next. The current moment becomes secondary. Something to move through rather than something to live in. This reduces the richness of experience, because the present is where life actually happens, not in the future, not in what is imagined, but in what is directly here. When attention returns to this, something begins to deepen. Simple moments become more vivid, more complete, because they are no longer overshadowed by what is expected later. There is also a shift in how ambition is experienced. Ambition becomes lighter. It is no longer driven by the need to escape the present. It becomes something that exists alongside presence. This creates balance. There is also a reduction in anxiety, because anxiety often comes from trying to control what has not yet happened. When the future is no longer the source of security, the need to manage it decreases. This creates calm. There is also a deeper layer to this shift. The identity that is tied to future achievement begins to loosen. The idea that worth depends on what will be accomplished fades. This creates stability. A stability that is not dependent on reaching a certain point. There is also a change in how time is experienced. Time feels less rushed, less pressured, because there is no longer a need to get somewhere in order to feel complete. This creates ease. There is also a shift in how hope is understood. Hope is no longer something that pulls attention away from the present. It becomes something that exists gently, without creating tension. This creates openness. There is also a reduction in dissatisfaction, because dissatisfaction often comes from comparing the present to the future. Without that comparison, the present becomes enough. This increases contentment. There is also a deeper connection to reality that exists now, not in projection, not in imagination, but in direct experience. This creates clarity. There is also a change in how decisions are made. Decisions are no longer driven solely by future outcomes. They are guided by what feels aligned in the present. This creates authenticity. There is also a deeper sense of trust that life does not need to be fully planned to be lived well. This reduces pressure. There is also a shift in how waiting is experienced. Waiting is no longer empty. It becomes part of life. This reduces restlessness. There is also a reduction in overthinking, because the mind is not constantly projecting forward. This creates mental space. There is also a deeper appreciation for small moments that would otherwise be overlooked. This increases satisfaction. There is also a change in how fulfillment is felt. Fulfillment is no longer delayed. It is found in the present. This creates stability. There is also a deeper sense of freedom. Freedom from needing the future to be different in order to feel at ease. Freedom to exist now. This freedom is quiet, but powerful. There is also a shift in how effort is experienced. Effort becomes something that is given in the present, not something that is only valuable if it leads to a future result. This creates meaning. There is also a deeper sense of peace, not because everything is resolved, but because nothing is being postponed. This peace is steady. There is also a reduction in fear. Fear of what might happen decreases, because attention is not focused there. This creates calm. There is also a deeper connection to presence that is not interrupted by constant projection. This creates awareness. There is also a shift in how life is experienced. Life becomes less about reaching a destination, more about being within the journey. This creates richness. There is also a deeper sense of enough in this moment, without needing something more. This creates contentment. Over time, this becomes natural. The pull toward the future weakens. The present becomes more vivid. The sense of postponement fades. And within this shift, something important becomes clear. Peace does not come from what is ahead. It comes from what is already here. This realization changes everything, because it removes the idea that life will begin later. Without that idea, life begins now, fully, directly, without delay. And in that beginning, something quietly returns, a sense of presence, a sense of completeness, a sense of being here, not waiting, not reaching, but living exactly where you are. And as life begins to return to the present, no longer postponed into some imagined future, something else quietly begins to settle. The mind is no longer reaching forward, but it can still be turning backward in a different way. Not searching for meaning this time, not waiting for closure, but searching for something else, an explanation. There is a particular kind of pain that does not stay in the moment it was created. It lingers, not because of what happened, but because of what was never clarified. A word spoken without care, a distance that appeared without warning, a change that was never explained. And after the moment passes, something inside keeps asking, why did this happen? What did I do? What were they thinking? These questions feel natural, they feel necessary, because the mind believes that if the right answer is found, something will finally make sense, something will settle. But often, the answer never comes. Or if it does, it is incomplete, unclear, inconsistent, and the mind continues to search. This search becomes a loop, a quiet but persistent return to the same questions, the same moments, the same attempt to understand what may never be explained clearly. This creates tension, not just from the memory of what happened, but from the ongoing effort to resolve it. Because the mind is trying to complete something that may not be complete. There is a belief beneath this effort, a belief that understanding will bring peace, that once the reason is known, the feeling will soften. But this is not always true, because sometimes the explanation is not enough, and sometimes it is not honest, and sometimes it is never given. When peace depends on receiving that explanation, it becomes fragile. It becomes tied to something outside of control. There is another way of relating to this. It begins with a quiet shift. A shift from needing to understand everything to allowing some things to remain unclear. Not because clarity is not valuable, but because it is not always available. When this is seen clearly, something begins to change. The urgency to know begins to soften. The need to chase answers begins to fade. This does not remove the pain, but it removes the added layer of searching. This creates space. Space where the experience can be felt without being constantly analyzed. Space where the heart is not tied to the need for explanation. There is also a shift in how the other person is perceived. Instead of seeing them as someone who holds the answer, they are seen as someone with their own limitations. Their ability to explain may be incomplete, their honesty may be partial, their awareness may be limited. This does not excuse behavior, but it changes the expectation. It removes the assumption that they can provide what is being sought. This reduces disappointment. There is also a deeper layer to this shift. The identity that depends on understanding begins to loosen. The idea that peace requires a clear explanation starts to fade. This creates independence, a form of emotional independence, where the heart does not rely on others to make sense of what it feels. There is also a change in how pain is experienced. Pain is no longer tied to a question. It becomes something that can be felt directly, without needing to be solved. This reduces its intensity. There is also a shift in how time is experienced. The past loses some of its hold, because the mind is no longer returning to it for answers. This brings attention back to the present. There is also a reduction in overthinking, because overthinking often comes from trying to understand what cannot be fully explained. When that effort stops, the mind becomes quieter. There is also a deeper sense of acceptance. Acceptance that not everything will be explained, that some actions will remain unclear. This reduces resistance. There is also a change in how forgiveness is experienced. Forgiveness becomes less about receiving an explanation and more about releasing the need for one. This creates freedom. There is also a shift in how trust is understood. Trust is no longer based on others being fully transparent. It becomes something that is felt internally. This creates stability. There is also a reduction in emotional dependency. The need for others to provide clarity decreases. This creates balance. There is also a deeper sense of clarity that comes from within, not from explanation, but from awareness, from observing the experience directly. This creates understanding that does not rely on external input. There is also a change in how boundaries are set. Boundaries become clearer because they are not based on waiting for explanation. They are based on what is felt. This creates strength. There is also a deeper sense of self-trust. Trust in one's own perception, one's own experience. This reduces doubt. There is also a quiet strength that begins to form, a strength that comes from not needing answers to move forward, the ability to continue without complete understanding. This strength is not loud, but it is steady. There is also a deeper sense of peace, not because everything is explained, but because nothing needs to be. This peace is subtle, but real. There is also a shift in how relationships are experienced. Relationships are no longer used to provide constant clarity. They become spaces of interaction without the pressure of explanation. This creates ease. There is also a deeper connection to reality. Reality that includes uncertainty. That includes incomplete understanding. This creates balance. There is also a reduction in frustration, because frustration often comes from unmet expectations. When the expectation for explanation is released, frustration decreases. There is also a deeper sense of freedom. Freedom from needing to know everything. Freedom from chasing answers. Freedom to move forward without complete clarity. And within this freedom, something important becomes clear. Peace does not come from understanding every action. It comes from not needing to. This realization changes everything because it removes a hidden source of tension, the belief that explanation is required for healing. Without that belief, the heart becomes lighter, not because the past is different, but because the need to explain it has softened. And from this place, something quietly returns, a sense of calm, a sense of clarity, a sense of being able to move forward without needing every piece to fit, without needing every question to be answered, just allowing what is and continuing. And as the heart begins to release the need for explanations, no longer chasing answers from those who may never offer them, something else quietly begins to settle. The mind is no longer circling the past in search of clarity, and in that stillness, another layer becomes visible. Not a wound this time, not a question, but a kind of noise, a constant, subtle noise that fills the inner space. It comes from many places at once, from thoughts that do not stop, from emotions that are held too tightly, from desires that keep multiplying, from distractions that never seem to end. And because this noise is always present, it begins to feel normal. But beneath it, there is a quiet exhaustion. There is a feeling of being full, but not satisfied. Busy, but not at peace. Surrounded, but not settled. This is where something important begins to reveal itself. The weight is not coming from lack. It is coming from excess. There is a belief that more creates a better life. More options, more stimulation, more engagement, more input. And at first, it feels like richness. But over time, it becomes overwhelming, because every addition brings attention with it. Every new thought, every new desire, every new attachment takes a small portion of awareness. And slowly, awareness becomes scattered. There is less space, less stillness, less clarity. This creates inner noise, not loud but constant, a background activity that never fully stops. It makes it difficult to rest, not physically, but mentally, because even in silence, the mind is moving. There is another way of relating to this. It begins with reducing, not as a loss, but as a return to what is essential. When excess begins to fall away, something changes. The noise begins to soften, not disappear instantly, but lose its intensity, because there is less to carry, less to process, less to hold on to. This creates space that is not filled with more input, but left open. And in that openness, something begins to appear. Awareness that was always present, but covered by constant activity, covered by accumulation, covered by the need for more. When simplicity begins to enter, awareness becomes clearer, more direct, more stable. This creates a different kind of experience, one that is not driven by constant stimulation, but by presence. There is also a shift in how thoughts are experienced. Without excess input, thoughts slow down. They become less chaotic, more organized. This creates clarity. There is also a reduction in emotional intensity. When there are fewer attachments, there is less to react to. This creates calm. There is also a deeper layer to this shift. The identity that is built around accumulation begins to loosen. The idea that more is needed to feel complete fades. This creates stability. There is also a change in how satisfaction is felt. Satisfaction becomes simpler, less dependent on external conditions. This creates contentment. There is also a shift in how time is experienced. Time feels less rushed, because there is less to manage. This creates ease. There is also a deeper appreciation for what remains. When excess is removed, what is left becomes clearer, more visible, more valuable. This increases gratitude. There is also a reduction in distraction, because there is less pulling attention in different directions. This creates focus. There is also a deeper connection to the present. Without constant input, attention settles. This creates awareness. There is also a change in how decisions are made. Decisions become simpler, because there are fewer variables. This creates clarity. There is also a reduction in stress, because there is less to maintain, less to control. This creates calm. There is also a deeper sense of freedom. Freedom from needing more. Freedom from managing excess. Freedom to exist without constant input. This freedom is quiet, but powerful. There is also a shift in how life is experienced. Life becomes less crowded, more open, more spacious. This creates peace. There is also a deeper sense of balance between activity and stillness, between engagement and rest. This creates stability. There is also a change in how value is perceived. Value is no longer placed in quantity. It is found in quality. This creates depth. There is also a reduction in comparison, because the focus is no longer on having more. This reduces tension. There is also a deeper sense of presence that is not interrupted by constant noise. This creates awareness. There is also a shift in how fulfillment is felt. Fulfillment becomes quieter, but more consistent. This creates stability. There is also a reduction in restlessness, because the need for more fades. This creates calm. There is also a deeper connection to simplicity. Simplicity is no longer seen as lack. It becomes something valuable, something supportive, something freeing. This creates a new perspective. There is also a quiet strength that begins to form, a strength that comes from needing less, the ability to remain at ease with what is present. This strength is subtle, but steady. There is also a deeper sense of peace, not because everything is reduced, but because nothing unnecessary is carried. This peace is real. There is also a shift in how the mind operates. The constant activity slows, the noise decreases. This creates clarity. Over time, this becomes natural. The desire for excess fades. The need for constant input weakens. The space remains. And within that space, something important becomes clear. Simplicity is not deprivation. It is the removal of what was never needed. It is the end of inner noise. And when that noise fades, something else becomes possible. A quiet awareness, a steady presence, a sense of being at ease, not because more has been gained, but because less is required. And in that reduction, something quietly returns. Clarity, calm, and a life that feels lighter from within. And as the noise within begins to fade, as simplicity creates space where there was once constant movement, something quieter begins to come into view. The mind is no longer crowded. The pace has slowed. The need for more has softened. And yet, there is still a subtle pull that remains, not toward things, not toward the future, not toward explanations, but toward something more delicate, the need to be seen, not always in obvious ways, not through attention or praise, but in moments of pain, in moments of hurt, in moments where something inside feels heavy and unspoken. There is a quiet expectation that someone should notice, that someone should understand without being told, that someone should recognize the weight being carried. This expectation is rarely spoken out loud. It appears in silence, in subtle signals, in small expressions that hope to be noticed. And when that recognition does not come, something tightens. Not just the original pain, but something added to it. A feeling of being unseen. A feeling that the experience is not fully acknowledged. This creates a second layer of suffering. The first layer is the wound itself. The second layer is the need for it to be seen. And often, the second layer becomes heavier than the first. Because it keeps the attention outward, waiting, hoping, looking for signs that someone understands. This waiting can be quiet, but it carries weight. Because the heart is no longer simply feeling, it is asking for recognition, asking for validation, asking for someone else to confirm what is already being experienced. There is another way of relating to this. It begins with a gentle shift, a shift from asking to be seen to allowing oneself to see inwardly, not rejecting connection, not denying the value of being understood, but releasing the expectation that every wound must be witnessed by others in order to heal. When this shift begins, something changes. The attention turns inward, the need to signal pain decreases. The urge to express it in a way that demands recognition softens. This does not mean suppressing emotion. It means holding it differently. Instead of projecting outward, the experience is allowed to exist within. This creates a different kind of space, a space where the wound is not performed, not explained, not shaped for others to understand. It is simply felt. And in that direct feeling, something begins to soften, because the energy that was previously used to seek recognition is now available for presence. Presence with the feeling itself. There is also a shift in how pain is experienced. Pain is no longer tied to the response of others. It becomes something that can move on its own, without needing to be confirmed. This reduces its weight. There is also a deeper layer to this shift. The identity that is built around being seen in suffering begins to loosen. The idea that one must be recognized in order to feel valid fades. This creates independence, a form of emotional independence, where the heart does not rely on external acknowledgement to process its experience. There is also a change in how relationships are experienced. Without the need to be seen in every pain, interactions become lighter. There is less pressure on others to respond perfectly, less expectation for them to understand everything. This creates ease. There is also a reduction in disappointment, because disappointment often comes from unmet expectations. When the expectation to be seen is released, disappointment decreases. There is also a deeper sense of self-compassion that begins to grow. Instead of waiting for others to recognize pain, there is a willingness to acknowledge it internally. This creates warmth, a quiet kindness toward oneself. There is also a shift in how expression is approached. Expression becomes more authentic, not driven by the need for recognition, but by the desire to share when it feels natural. This creates honesty. There is also a deeper connection to the inner world. Without constant outward attention, awareness turns inward. This allows for deeper understanding. There is also a reduction in emotional dependency. The need for others to validate feelings decreases. This creates stability. There is also a change in how silence is experienced. Silence is no longer filled with the expectation of being noticed. It becomes a space where feelings can exist without pressure. This creates calm. There is also a deeper sense of acceptance. Acceptance that not every experience will be seen by others. This reduces resistance. There is also a shift in how healing is understood. Healing is no longer something that depends on external response. It becomes something that develops internally, through presence, through awareness, through compassion. There is also a reduction in comparison. The need to measure one's pain against others' recognition fades. This reduces tension. There is also a deeper appreciation for quiet moments, moments where nothing is shared, nothing is explained, nothing is seen externally. These moments become valuable. There is also a shift in how attention is used. Attention is no longer directed outward in search of validation. It becomes focused inward. This creates clarity. There is also a deeper sense of peace that begins to appear. Not because pain disappears, but because it is no longer tied to being seen. This peace is subtle, but steady. There is also a change in how connection is experienced. Connection becomes something that is chosen, not something that is needed to process every feeling. This creates balance. There is also a deeper sense of freedom. Freedom from needing to be recognized in every moment of pain. Freedom to experience without external confirmation. Freedom to heal quietly. And within this freedom, something important becomes clear. Not every wound needs an audience. Not every pain needs to be seen to be real. Some healing begins in silence, in inward attention, in self-compassion. This realization changes everything, because it removes a hidden source of suffering. The belief that pain must be witnessed to be valid. Without that belief, the heart becomes lighter. Not because the pain is gone, but because it is no longer being carried outward. And from this place, something gentle begins to grow. A quiet understanding, a steady compassion, a way of holding pain that does not depend on others. And in that way, something quietly settles. A peace that does not need to be seen, a peace that simply exists. And as the need to be seen in every pain begins to soften, and the heart learns to hold its own wounds without turning outward for recognition, something even deeper begins to settle. The inner space becomes quieter. There is less reaching, less signaling, less dependence. And in that quiet, a new question begins to appear. If nothing is being chased, if nothing is being demanded, if outcomes are no longer tightly held, then what remains? There is a quiet fear that sometimes arises at this point, a fear that letting go of outcomes might lead to indifference, that without attachment, care might disappear, that if nothing is expected, then effort might lose its meaning. This fear feels reasonable because the mind often connects attachment with importance. If something matters, it should be held tightly. If someone matters, their response should matter deeply. If an effort is made, the result should carry weight. But beneath this belief, there is a misunderstanding. Attachment is not the same as care. In fact, attachment often distorts care. There is a way of caring that is heavy, a way of loving that is filled with fear, a way of acting that is tied to outcome. This form of care is not clean, it carries pressure, because it depends on something happening in return. A certain response, a certain result, a certain confirmation, and when that does not happen, the feeling changes. Care turns into frustration, love turns into disappointment, effort turns into exhaustion. This is not because care is wrong, it is because it is tied to outcome. When care is attached to results, it becomes fragile. It is easily shaken, easily disturbed. Because the result is never fully within control. There is another way of relating to this. It begins with a quiet shift. A shift from holding outcomes tightly to allowing them to unfold, not as a loss of interest, but as a release of control. This shift changes the nature of care. Care becomes lighter, not weaker, but clearer, because it is no longer mixed with fear. It is no longer dependent on what happens next. It becomes something that is given freely, without needing to secure a result. This creates a different kind of connection, one that is not driven by expectation, but by presence. When someone is cared for without needing them to respond in a certain way, the interaction becomes more open, more genuine, more stable, because it is not built on a condition. There is also a shift in how effort is experienced. Effort is no longer measured by outcome. It becomes something that is expressed fully in the moment. This creates satisfaction because the value is in the act itself, not in what it produces. There is also a deeper layer to this shift. The identity that is tied to results begins to loosen. The idea that success defines worth fades. This creates stability, a stability that is not dependent on achievement. There is also a change in how failure is experienced. Failure is no longer seen as a loss of value. It becomes an event, a moment, something that happens but does not define. This reduces fear, because fear often comes from the possibility of failure. When outcomes are not held tightly, this fear decreases. There is also a shift in how compassion is felt. Compassion becomes deeper because it is no longer conditional. It does not depend on someone responding in a certain way. It does not require a specific outcome. It exists on its own. This creates warmth, a steady, open form of care that is not easily shaken. There is also a reduction in emotional volatility. Without attachment to results, reactions become less intense. This creates calm. There is also a deeper sense of presence. Because attention is no longer split between the moment and the outcome, this creates clarity. There is also a change in how relationships are experienced. Relationships become less transactional, less dependent on exchange. This creates authenticity. There is also a deeper appreciation for the process, not just the result. This increases engagement. There is also a reduction in pressure, because the need to achieve a certain outcome decreases. This creates ease. There is also a deeper sense of trust. Trust in the unfolding of events, trust in the ability to respond. This reduces anxiety. There is also a shift in how control is perceived. Control is no longer the source of security. This creates flexibility. There is also a deeper connection to reality. Reality that is not shaped by expectation. This creates honesty. There is also a change in how motivation is experienced. Motivation becomes internal, not driven by reward. This creates sustainability. There is also a deeper sense of freedom. Freedom to care without fear. Freedom to act without attachment. Freedom to love without condition. This freedom is quiet, but powerful. There is also a shift in how fulfillment is felt. Fulfillment is no longer delayed. It is found in the act itself. This creates contentment. There is also a deeper sense of peace. Not because outcomes are perfect, but because they are not required to be. This peace is steady. There is also a reduction in fear of loss, because attachment to results decreases. This creates resilience. There is also a deeper sense of connection. Connection that is not dependent on outcome. This creates stability. There is also a quiet strength that begins to form, a strength that comes from being able to care deeply without needing control. This strength is subtle, but enduring. There is also a deeper sense of balance between effort and acceptance, between action and letting go. This creates harmony. Over time, this becomes natural. The grip on outcomes loosens. The need for results fades. The act itself becomes enough. And within this shift, something important becomes clear. Detachment does not remove care, it purifies it. It removes fear, it removes pressure, it removes condition. What remains is something clearer, something steadier, something more real, a form of compassion that does not depend on what happens, a form of love that is not tied to outcome, and in that space something quietly deepens, a connection to life that is not fragile, a way of being that is not shaken by results, a peace that exists within action itself. And from this place, life begins to feel different, not less meaningful, but more true, because nothing is being forced and everything is being lived. And as care becomes lighter, no longer tied to outcomes, no longer shaped by fear of what may or may not happen, something even more subtle begins to reveal itself. The grip on results has softened, but there is still a quiet calculation that can remain hidden beneath the surface, not about outcomes in a large sense, but about return, a silent measuring that happens almost without awareness, a way of giving that is not fully free. Because somewhere beneath the action, there is a question: what will come back? There is a pattern that forms slowly. Kindness is offered, but a part of the mind keeps track. Loyalty is given, but a part of the heart expects the same in return. Care is expressed, but there is a quiet hope that it will be matched. This is not always obvious. It can feel natural, even fair. Because giving and receiving seem connected, balanced, mutual. But when every act of giving carries an expectation of return, something begins to change. Giving becomes conditional, not on the surface, but underneath. There is a hidden agreement, an unspoken contract. And when that contract is not fulfilled, something shifts. The same kindness that felt warm now feels heavy. The same loyalty now feels unappreciated. The same care now feels one-sided. This creates tension, not because the act itself was wrong, but because it was tied to an expectation. This expectation turns generosity into transaction. It adds weight to every interaction, because now every action is being measured, every response is being evaluated, every moment is being compared. This creates a subtle form of suffering, a constant checking, a constant wondering: am I getting back what I give? This question may not always be spoken, but it shapes experience. It creates dissatisfaction, even in moments that could have been simple, because attention is no longer on the act itself. It is on the balance. There is another way of relating to this. It begins with a quiet shift, a shift from giving with expectation to giving without needing return, not as sacrifice, not as loss, but as freedom. When this shift begins, something changes. The act of giving becomes complete on its own. It no longer needs to be followed by a response. It no longer needs to be matched. It exists fully in the moment it is given. This creates lightness, because there is no longer a need to carry the act forward, no need to track it, no need to remember it. There is also a shift in how others are perceived. Without the expectation of return, their actions are no longer measured against what has been given. This reduces judgment. There is also a deeper layer to this shift. The identity that is tied to fairness begins to loosen. The idea that everything must be balanced fades. This creates openness. There is also a change in how relationships are experienced. Relationships become less transactional, less about exchange, more about presence. This creates authenticity. There is also a reduction in disappointment, because disappointment often comes from unmet expectations. When expectation is removed, disappointment decreases. There is also a deeper sense of satisfaction, because satisfaction is no longer dependent on what comes back. It is found in the act itself. This creates stability. There is also a shift in how kindness is felt. Kindness becomes cleaner, not mixed with hidden demands. This creates warmth. There is also a deeper connection to generosity. Generosity becomes something that flows naturally, not something that is calculated. This creates ease. There is also a reduction in resentment, because resentment often comes from feeling that something was given without return. When return is not expected, resentment fades. There is also a deeper sense of freedom. Freedom from keeping score, freedom from measuring, freedom from needing balance. This freedom is quiet, but powerful. There is also a shift in how energy is used. Energy is no longer spent tracking interactions. It becomes available for presence. This creates clarity. There is also a deeper sense of trust. Trust that giving does not need to be secured. This reduces fear. There is also a change in how value is perceived. Value is no longer placed in what is received. It is found in what is given. This creates meaning. There is also a deeper appreciation for connection. Connection that is not based on exchange. This creates depth. There is also a reduction in comparison. The need to compare what is given and received fades. This reduces tension. There is also a deeper sense of peace, not because everything is equal, but because nothing needs to be. This peace is steady. There is also a shift in how expectations are formed. Expectations become lighter, less rigid. This creates flexibility. There is also a deeper connection to presence, because attention is no longer split between giving and waiting. This creates awareness. There is also a reduction in emotional dependency. The need for others to respond in a certain way decreases. This creates independence. There is also a deeper sense of balance, not in exchange, but in being. This creates stability. There is also a quiet strength that begins to form, a strength that comes from being able to give without needing return, the ability to act without attachment. This strength is subtle, but enduring. There is also a deeper sense of fulfillment that is not delayed, that exists in the moment of action. This creates contentment. There is also a shift in how love is experienced. Love becomes less conditional, less tied to response. This creates openness. There is also a deeper sense of freedom, freedom from needing reciprocity, freedom from hidden contracts, freedom to give fully. And within this freedom, something important becomes clear. Giving does not need to be balanced to be meaningful. It does not need to return to be complete. It is complete in itself. This realization changes everything because it removes a hidden source of tension, the need for emotional return on investment. Without that need, interactions become lighter, more honest, more free. And from this place, something quietly deepens. A way of relating that is not based on exchange, a way of giving that is not measured, a way of living that is not keeping score. And in that way, something settles, a peace that does not depend on what comes back, a peace that simply exists in what is given. And now something becomes clear. The more that was released, the lighter everything became, less control, and the mind stopped breaking under pressure. Less need to be understood, and the heart stopped begging for validation. Less demand from love, and connection became cleaner, calmer, real. Less attachment to outcomes, and effort became peaceful instead of fearful. Less need for answers, and the past lost its grip. Less dependence on things, and the inner world became richer. Less fear of being alone, and silence turned into strength. Less desire to be special, and life finally felt enough. Less chasing of the future, and the present opened fully. Less expectation from others, and relationships stopped feeling heavy. Less noise, and awareness returned. Less need to be seen, and healing became quiet and complete. You started with a world that felt demanding, and ended with a mind that demands nothing. That is where real strength lives. Not in controlling everything, not in having everything, but in needing less from everything. Because the less you need, the less life can take from you, and the less life can take from you, the freer you become. So if something inside you felt lighter while listening to this, write in the comments, "I need less." Not for anyone else, just as a quiet reminder to yourself. And if you want more content that helps you think clearly, feel deeply, and live with real inner strength, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because the next lesson might be the one that changes everything. Take your time, breathe, and carry this with you. You already have enough.